Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well wherever you are in Middle-earth. Years ago, I did a 15-part series on the complete timeline of Middle-earth, at least as far as the major chapters, events, and stories go from the Silmarillion, parts of the Unfinished Tales, Appendices, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, as well as a little bit of what we know that came after. Here for you all today are those videos put together without the intros and outros, no sponsors, with updated audio and even bits of repair and revision of certain parts of the stories to make it all as accurate as possible. Certainly there are some small nuances that I discuss more in other videos, and these videos are from the past 9 or so years, so I was quite a bit younger when I made each of them, but regardless, I hope you enjoy this compilation. This will have more depth and quantity than my complete timeline of Middle-earth video, and it just gets into more depth than that, but still check out that video if you want a more simplistic overview of the whole timeline. Also, shout out to Tolkien Gateway, the encyclopedias of Arda and so forth, even the few amounts of times that I used the Lord of the Rings wiki. While all of this information obviously has its source in Tolkien's works, and that's primarily where I draw all of this stuff from, of course. These resources helped me organize my thoughts and tell these stories way back when I made the series originally. And Tolkien Gateway especially does a great job of having articles about all this stuff. However, I would recommend double-checking information there, and honestly everywhere, because I have found more than a few mistakes on some of their articles. Granted, I'm sure some of my videos have mistakes for sure. I try to correct them in the comments below when I can, so if there are mistakes even in this compilation video, let me know and I'll try to kind of make a list in the comments of corrections there. So, my friends, go ahead and relax, grab a snack, a drink, because this will be quite a long video and I want you to enjoy yourself as we go through it. And thank you all so much for joining me here today. Let's begin that tale of Tolkien's Legendarium together. Before the stories that we all know and cherish, the arrival of Aragorn to his throne, the destruction of Sauron and his One Ring, the defeat of Smaug the Dragon, and even before the downfall of the original Dark Lord, Melkor, and the tale of the Silmarils, there was only one entity among the space of what was to be his universe. In the beginning, there was Eru Iluvatar, and he was all. In the timeless halls before creation, Iluvatar began to think. Through his thoughts, the Ainur came to be, and he taught them how to create music. The Ainur were the grandest spirits to exist in the Legendarium, and they were beings of great power that would become the Valar and the Maiar. At first, they only learned from him and from each other, by singing in small groups and observing the other groups and learning of their interpersonal existence. Eventually, Iluvatar brought the Ainur together and told them of a great composition that was to be made. It would be the grandest of all songs that were previously made, and they were allowed to put their own thoughts, visions, and free will into it. They were allowed to do this as Iluvatar created them with the flame imperishable, or the secret fire which commended true life and free will. Their Fear, or spirits, were the essences of this true life. The Ainur bowed to their lord at his description of the song that was to be. When they began, the song was a beautiful compilation of voices, some that sang like trumpets, and others like harps, and some like choirs. But before long, faults and great dissonance entered the song. This was Melkor's doing. Melkor was the greatest and most powerful of all of the Ainur, and he had wandered the void of space, and sought to find the flame imperishable on his own in order to create his own life under his dominion. But he failed in that task, as the flame imperishable was Iluvatar's power and gift, and his alone. The song became tumultuous, and was called to a stop by Iluvatar. He then reflected upon the song, and he smiled. After this reaction, the second song of the Ainur began. The second song was alike and unlike to the first song, and grew in beauty over time. But eventually, the discord rose again. This time it was far greater and more overpowering. As Melkor sang with more and more power, some of the Ainur stopped singing with dismay, but one who was to be known as Manwë, who, in Iluvatar's mind, was the brother of Melkor, countered this discord most. But eventually, Melkor's music became the entire sound of the song. At this, Iluvatar rose from his seat and stopped the song. His face was stern in reaction this time, and then he rose his right hand to begin the next song immediately. This song had begun during the confusion of the second song, and this one was very unlike the others. It sounded like the rippling of soft and sweet notes, but grew louder and more powerful with time. In its depth, this song became two. One song with sorrow beyond measure and beauty, and the other was a loud song of splendor and repetition. One didn't overcome the other, and eventually the Song of Splendor wove the grandest notes of the Song of Sorrow into it. The strife and differences in the two themes caused a great shaking in the dwelling of Iluvatar and the void beyond. Quote, "One chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar. The music ceased." End quote. Iluvatar stood again, and afterwards he told the Ainur of the vastness of the music, and what would happen if discord were brought to it, as Melkor had done. He then gave the Ainur a vision of, quote, "a world that was globed amid the void, but was not of it." End quote. This world was to be known as Arda. This world would eventually house Valinor, Beleriand, and Middle-earth. The Ainur saw the history that would happen in this world unfold before them, and they witnessed what part each of them had played in its conception. Even Melkor had contributed to it, and even his deepest themes and perversions had all been a part of Iluvatar's master plan. In this vision, they saw the children of Iluvatar, who none of them had contributed to the song to create, but rather the children were a part of Iluvatar's plan to create. The Ainur became enamored with the earth, and bound to its fate. Even Melkor, who above all desired to rule over all of the other Ainur and the children of Iluvatar both. They also saw the seas and the waters that would be in Arda, and they became sure that the water would be a great factor of all life. They saw the light that filled Arda as well, and observed its majesty. It is said that they might have seen the history of Arda up until the dominion of men, but not afterwards. This could have happened as the free peoples, and men especially, have free will, and their destinies are not made before them. During the vision, Iluvatar named Ulmo, the Vala and Lord of the Waters, and he was named second after Melkor, as Iluvatar and Melkor had already had previous interactions already. Ulmo learns that none of Melkor's fires or snows that he could send would have an effect upon the seas. Iluvatar then names Manwë, the Vala and the Lord of the Winds and Airs. Ulmo and Manwë are thus named the chief servants of Eru Iluvatar. After they are named, the vision that all of the Ainur saw of Arda was abruptly brought to an end, and the world of Arda was set into motion. Eru Iluvatar sent the flame imperishable into the universe, and it is called Ea, meaning it is, or let it be, and it is the true realization of the first music of the Ainur. Time began, and so did Middle-earth and all of Arda itself. 4 of the Valar are sent to Arda to make it ready for the children of Iluvatar in the time to come. When the Valar came to Arda, it was shapeless and uncrafted. It was but a barren plain ready to be worked upon. On this plain, Melkor, who was the most powerful of all of the Ainur and still was, claimed the world for himself. But the other Valar who were with him would not let it be. Thus, Melkor disrupted many efforts of the world's creation, and his assaults wore upon Manwë, Ulmo, and Aule, who were the other 3 Valar alongside him, tasked to create the world. After a time of struggling, Manwë calls the other Valar and Maiar, or the lesser of the Ainur, that were loyal to him, and together they drove off Melkor for a time. The other Valar recognized Manwë as their king, as he was compassionate, kind, and unconcerned for his own power, and it was he who best knew Iluvatar's vision for Arda. But this once again draws the ire of Melkor, and he returns to begin the first war inside time. His goal was to try to hinder the creation of the world and to fight against Manwë's throne. The first battles aren't recorded, but as Melkor tried to undo everything that the Valar did, it is seen that he cannot truly destroy or spoil their work, and the earth of our grand legendarium is made ready for the children of Iluvatar. The first music of the Ainur is the beginning, and possibly the end and renewal of Arda in the legendarium. The first 3 songs created the universe and the world, and throughout many years, Manwë, the king of the Valar, reflects upon the compositions and learns from them different pieces that he did not notice at the time of its making when he was just one of the Ainur. And though none, while they were singing it, truly knew what they were doing or creating during the music, Eru Iluvatar directed them to create his vision, and eventually they would come to understand what they had done and created. This first music would set all into motion until Dagor Daggerath, if it were to ever happen. According to the second prophecy of Mandos, the final battle would be fought at the end of the world, when all peoples and Ainur of the universe would fight together. Manwë's forces against Melkor's, and after the death of the Vala Melkor by Turin's hand, and after the recovery of the Silmarils by Erendil, the world shall be renewed with the second music of the Ainur, where men too would participate alongside the Ainur in the creation of the next universe. This would be far after the time of men, and after the events of the Lord of the Rings, again, if it were to happen. Though I really like the idea of Dagor Daggerath, it was only a prophecy of Mandos, who was the doomsman of the Valar. And according to Christopher Tolkien himself, his father did away with this idea of this final battle and Dagor Daggerath, but the possibility of it still remains within our legendarium. So I'll leave that to you guys. What do you think? Would Dagor Daggerath happen, or would something else happen at the end of all time? Let me know in the comments below. But indeed, the music of the Ainur was the heart and the creation of the entirety of the universe, and it was the greatest of powers, next to Eru Ilúvatar himself. After the creation of Arda, but before Melkor's first assault against the Valar, the Ainur, the beings who had helped sing the universe into creation, had already started to enter the world from Ilúvatar's halls. Varda, or Elbereth as she would later be called, created the Elder Stars as the only source of light in the world. These would be the only pieces to emit light until the two lamps of Valinor are created. After the first war with the Valar, Melkor's spirit dispersed into the world. This is called Arda Mard, and with Melkor's spirit now affecting the world, and the children of Ilúvatar directly, evils that did not exist before are infused into the world itself. Plagues, the fading of the elves into spirits, and other concepts began because of Melkor's loss in the first war with the Valar. However, Melkor was defeated for now, and he retreated into the void beyond the world. When Tulkas, the champion of the Valar, came into the world, that age after Ainu Lendale, or the first music of the Ainur, ended, and the years of the lamps began. These two lamps were named Iluin, meaning sky blue, and Ormal, meaning high gold, and they were the first true givers of light in Arda before the two trees of Valinor. Manwë and his wife Varda had created and lit these two lamps. Iluin, that acted like the moon, was set upon the pillar of Helkar, and Ormal, that acted as the sun, was set in the deepest south upon Ringol. Together, these two lamps lit Middle-earth. Where the light met is where the Valar originally dwelt after the creation of the world, upon the Isle of Almaren. This island was set in the middle of the world, and eventually wildlife and nature came to live there. In this first peace that was felt in the universe, Melkor came out of the void, with rebel Maiar that became his servants. These were the Balrogs and Sauron. In secret, Melkor created Autumno and Angband in the far north of Middle-earth. The peace of the Valar was interrupted by these beings, as Melkor destroyed the two lamps and broke the lands, destroying the island of the Valar. Thus Melkor brought an end to the first two lights of Middle-earth. Where the lake and the island were would become the Sea of Helkar, where Cuiviénen, the first land of the Elves, would be. The Valar fled to Aman, while Melkor ruled Middle-earth for this short while. In their retreat, Valinor was established as the realm of the Valar. However, the entire world was left in the dark, so the two trees of the Valar were created by the Song of Yavanna, the Vala of the earth and nature. They were named Laurelin, the golden tree, who was female, and Telperion, the silver tree, who was male. Once again, this is very similar to the sun and the moon, as the two trees were actually the sun and the moon's ancestors. These sat upon the hill Izelohar, located just outside of Valimar, the capital city of Valinor. The two trees grew in the presence of the Valar, and they were watered by the tears of Nienna, the saddest of the Ainur. These two trees would increase and diminish in light during a 12-hour cycle that was considered day and night. Thus, a new age, the years of the trees, began, and this is truly the age that would produce the greatest of miracles and the most divine creatures. As this video is primarily a continuation of the Timeline of Arda, I will summarize the events of this age and focus mostly on the two trees of Valinor. But if you would like me to return in the future to make more in-depth videos about these subjects, I would be glad to. Near the beginning of this age, the dwarves and the Ents are created, though the dwarves are made to sleep until Iluvatar's firstborn, the Elves, awake. Some years later, Varda gathers the light of the two trees of the Valar to make the great stars and the sickle of the Valar in the north as a challenge to Melkor. These stars would provide light around the world, even in the places far away from the two trees of the Valar. Finally, the first race of beings, the Elves, are awoken in Cuivanian, a place near where the first island of the Valar was, in the far east of Middle-earth. They awoke beneath Varda's stars, and so, they loved them and her the most. They would name her Elbereth, and sing songs about her in future ages. After they were awoken, Melkor began capturing the Elves and perverting them into orcs. However, Melkor himself was captured and imprisoned by the Valar when they destroyed Utumno, while Sauron continued to serve him in Angband. Arome, the hunter of the Valar, found the Elves, and took 3 of them to be ambassadors to the Valar after spending much time with them. The 3 elven ambassadors were Ingwe of the Vanyar, Finwë of the Noldor, and Elwë of the Teleri. These elves were entranced by the Valar and the light of the two trees. Thus, the two parties decided that the Eldar would live in Valinor with the Valar. The great journey of the elves begins, though not all of the elves make it to Valinor from Cuivanian, as some of the Teleri break off from the group because their leader, Elwë, or Thingol as he is later known, beholds and falls in love with Melion, whose line would create Luthien and eventually Aragorn and Arwen. The separation of the Eldar was known as the Sundering of the Elves. However, most of the elves do make it to Valinor, and those who do see the beauty of the two trees, and they are forever changed. In later times, the elves would be divided between the Calaquendi, who had seen the light of the two trees, and the Moraquendi, who had not. Finwë, one of the first ambassadors of the elves to the Valar, had a son with Miriel named Feanor. In the birth process, Feanor's spirit killed his mother, and Finwë mourned for her. Feanor is the elf that would change the course of history in Tolkien's works, for better or for worse. Some other renowned elves are also born during the years of the trees, such as Luthien, Fingolfin, Galadriel, and others. During his life, Feanor would take some of the light from the two trees and create the 3 Silmarils, stones that emit pure, unfettered light. Using Feanor's ambition, Melkor, who was released from his imprisonment many years after making the first orcs, deceives Feanor and gets him banished from his home of Tirion, the city of the Noldor. And so, Feanor hates Melkor already, but as we shall see, it'll get far worse. During a festival in the later years of the two trees, as this age takes place over many thousands of years, Feanor is invited to Valimar by King Manwë to make amends with the elf, and Melkor allies himself with Ungoliant the Spider, and destroys the two trees of Valinor. Melkor stabs the trees while Ungoliant eats their sap and drinks the tears of Nienna. After this, Melkor kills Feanor's father Finwë and steals the 3 Silmarils. Then he retreats towards Beleriand in the east. From here we see the Eldar follow Feanor and his hatred for both the Valar and Melkor, but that is a topic for the next video in this series. The two trees of Valinor, like other pieces of Tolkien's works, are relics of majesty and beauty that are fouled by those with evil intentions. Luckily, the Valar had saved a flower and a fruit that Yavanna and Nienna created the sun and the moon with. In future days, the two trees would stand as a symbol of divinity under their children, the sun and the moon. The Doors of Durin that would come to protect the west wall of Moria has 2 trees imprinted on them in such symbolism. As for the White Tree of Gondor, a look-alike tree was made in Telparion's image, though it lacked the light of Telparion. It was named Galathilion and placed in Tirion. Its descendant was Celeborn, the Tree of Erysia, and then Nimloth of Numenor, onto the White Trees of Gondor in the 3rd and 4th Ages. The symbol of Telparion came to stand for royalty, furthering Gondor's connection to the sun and moon. Again, this is another sign to respect nature, as its reality is far greater than that which meets the eye. In the next part of this series, we will talk about Feanor and his war on Melkor during the last years of the trees and the early part of the First Age. We start our discussion just after the destruction of the two trees of Valinor, in 1495 of the Years of the Trees, when Melkor and Ungoliant fled into the east and left Valinor, hidden from the gaze of Arome the Hunter by the unlight of Ungoliant. The two crossed the Helcaraxe, the ice bridge connecting Aman to Middle-earth, and Melkor hoped to make it to Angband before completely fulfilling his promise to Ungoliant. This promise was to let Ungoliant devour the gems that Melkor had plundered from Finwë, Feanor's father at Formenos, after he had slain Finwë. Ungoliant saw through Melkor's plan to escape his promise, however, and she demanded the gems. While Melkor did surrender the lesser gems of Finwë to the spider, he hid the Silmarils in his right hand, while they burned the Dark Lord. After Melkor refused to give up the Silmarils, Ungoliant attacked her companion. She bound him in her webs, and was a match for the Dark Lord, as she had grown so strong and large after devouring the two trees and the lesser gems. Melkor cried out in pain, and his Balrogs heard him. After all these years without their master, the Balrogs survived and remained loyal, so they came swiftly from the depths of Angband. They drove Ungoliant off with their flame, but Melkor recalled them, letting Ungoliant flee to the south. The demons followed Melkor back to the ruins of Angband, to rebuild it once more in the name of the Dark Lord, in 1497 of the Years of the Trees. As these deeds took place, back in Valinor, the Valar and Noldor took counsel in the aftermath of the darkening of Valinor. The stars of Varda shone in the sky, but they were the only sources of light in the land. Yavanna and the others mourned over the loss of the two trees, but the Valar called upon Feanor to relinquish the three Silmarils that he had crafted with the light of the trees, for they alone could restore some measure of the two trees. They knew not at this time that Melkor had sacked Formenos, the home of Feanor, and took the Silmarils for himself. Feanor sat in silence at this request, for it was a heavy inquiry. Aule the Smith alone knew the weight of this plea, and he bade his fellow Valar to await Feanor's decision. Feanor said that the Silmarils could be made only once, and their destruction would mean the death of Feanor's heart and being. He claimed that he would be the first to be slain of all the Eldar and Aman, to which Mandos, the doomsman of the Valar, enigmatically replied that he would be not the first. None knew what Mandos had meant. Feanor felt as though he were surrounded by his enemies, and the lies of Melkor played their part. Feanor believed that the Silmarils would not be safe if the Valar possessed them, and as Melkor was of the Valar, Feanor believed that Melkor best understood the intentions of his kin. Feanor denied giving them the Silmarils, and said that if he was forced to surrender them, the Valar would indeed be alike to Melkor. Nienna mourned, but at that moment messengers came from Formenos, and they relayed all that had been found at the house of Feanor. Finwë was slain, for he alone had not fled the Dark Lord. The stronghold was broken, and all of the jewels of the Noldor had been taken, including the Silmarils. In reaction to this, Feanor cursed Melkor and named him Morgoth, the black foe of the world. He cursed the summons of Manwë, thinking he could have availed his father had he stood with him. It is wondered how Feanor's future path would have been changed had he agreed to give the Silmarils before learning of their theft at the hands of Melkor. As the Valar would sit in the darkness in the Ring of Doom, with the Maiar and Vanyar beside them, most of the Noldor returned to Tirion. The lamp Mindon dimly lit the city, and Feanor would gather the Noldor to him. Feanor spoke against the Valar, and he told of the death of King Finwë of the Noldor. He rallied his folk against Morgoth, inspiring longing in their hearts for their homeland of Middle-earth across the sea. Finally, he spoke to them of regaining the Silmarils and standing uncontested in mastery over the beauty of Arda. Not only was Feanor skilled in the work of craft, but in the power of speech as well. He and his sons would then swear their infamous oath that would haunt them until the end of their days. They swore in the name of Iluvatar, and named Manwë, Varda, and the mountain of Taniquetil in witness, that they should pursue any being that possesses a Silmaril and bears it from them. The Noldor then held conflictual discourse, for some such as Fingolfin and Turgon spoke against Feanor, while others such as Galadriel stood with Feanor and his plan to leave Valinor. Other elves spoke out also, until Feanor was triumphant in the matter. Feanor marshaled his folk, and some such as Fingolfin would join him, and not abandon their kin. Most of the folk of Tirion would not name Feanor king, however, for they loved Fingolfin more. Thus the host was divided into two parts. The vanguard was made of Feanor and his followers, while those who came behind were Fingolfin's host. Those who would march furthest behind would be the most loath to leave Valinor. A messenger came from Manwë, petitioning the elves that they need not leave, but the Valar would not stop or help them after this point. Feanor alone was exiled by the king of the Valar, and none others needed to follow him. This did not stop the elves, and Feanor dismissed the messenger, claiming that it was better to take action than to sit in idleness, as he believed the Valar did. So the Noldor left, and journeyed to the docks of the Teleri elves at Alqualondë. Feanor thought to persuade those elves to join him in his venture, and to lend them their ships to cross the seas. The Teleri and their lord Olwë, the prince of Alqualondë, were unmoved, however, and they did not desire to oppose the will of the Valar. Feanor grew angry at their denial, and he left. Feanor waited outside of the walls until his part of the elven host was assembled, and then they attacked their friends and kin. The kinslaying at Alqualondë began. Fingolfin's host came behind, not knowing the reason for the conflict. After seeing their kin among the Noldor being slain, many of Fingolfin's followers went forth and joined in the battle. Had they known what the cause of the fighting was, Fingolfin and his elves would likely have taken a different action. Some thought the Teleri only fought at the bidding of the Valar to hinder the Noldor on their course. The Teleri were decimated, and while some of the Noldor were slain, the Teleri were utterly defeated. Feanor's forces took control of the ships and went north along the coast. Uwinen, a Maya of the sea, wept for the Teleri, and the ocean rose up in wrath against the Noldor, and sank many of their stolen ships. However, the majority of the Noldor escaped, and whether by ship or land, they continued north. They came to the edge of Valinor, and a dark figure stood on the rocks above them. Some claim that this was Mandos himself, rather than some lesser herald of Manwë. In a booming and terrible voice, the figure spoke the doom of Mandos, or the doom of the Noldor as it is also known, telling of the sorrows of the Noldor to come, and that those who do not perish in Middle-earth or come back to Mandos will become shadows of regret before the race of men. Many among the Noldor quailed, but Feanor stood defiant. After these words, Finarfin would forsake the march, as he was filled with sorrow, and he resented the house of Feanor, for he had kinship with Olwë of the Teleri, who was now slain. Many of his people went with him while his children would remain behind. Finarfin was thus pardoned, and he became the king of the Noldor who remained in Valinor. Fingolfin's followers remained with Feanor and his folk, for they would not abandon their kin, and they continued northwards, coming to the edges of the Helcaraxe. Feanor halted the host to decide his next course of action. While the Helcaraxe seemed impassable, they still had ships. At this time, many of Fingolfin's elves began to resent Feanor, and they cursed him. Feanor knew what was being said about him by Fingolfin's host. Thus Feanor and his host, that he deemed loyal, took the ships suddenly to cross the sea, leaving Fingolfin's host behind. Once Feanor's elves arrived in Drengist in Middle-earth during the year 1497 of the Years of the Trees, Maethros, the eldest son of Feanor, asked his father who they would send back to ferry the rest of the elves over the sea. Feanor laughed and dismissed this, forsaking his kin that he had left in Aman, for they had cursed him. Thus, Feanor ordered the ships to be burned, and Fingolfin's host saw the flames far off. Feanor would go off to fight in the battle under stars, but we shall discuss that in future episodes. Fingolfin was filled with bitterness at his half-brother's betrayal, but he was determined to go to Middle-earth rather than to return to Valinor in shame. So Fingolfin took his folk to cross the Helcaraxe. Many would fall during this journey, but those that survived would finally come into Middle-earth, with little love for Feanor and his house. Fingolfin's host would step foot into Middle-earth under the first rising of the moon in the year 1500 of the Years of the Trees, and they would blow their trumpets at their arrival. This was only the beginning of the ages under the sun to come. The War of the Jewels would begin, and the first risings of the moon and sun would be concurrent with the coming of Iluvatar's second-born, the race of men, into the world. Last time we ended with the Noldor under Fingolfin coming into Middle-earth under the rising of the new moon at the end of the Years of the Trees, but I want to take us back a few years and look at the elves that were already in Middle-earth, the Sindar, and the events that happened concurrent with Fingolfin's march. In the year 1497 of the Years of the Trees, Morgoth returned from Valinor with possession of the Silmarils. He returned to his fell fortress of Angband to begin anew, and raised the peaks of the Thangorodrim to protect his fortress. Over the years, many orcs had multiplied in the darkness of that land. Until this point, the Sindar had mostly wandered free in Beleriand, while many still lived in places such as Menegroth in Aglador or the havens of Eglarist. The time for peaceful roaming had ended, however, as Morgoth's forces found new strength in Middle-earth. While Feanor and Fingolfin's Noldor were still in the west, Morgoth tried to take Middle-earth with one terrible invasion, but he underestimated the Sindar and their allies. The orcs came forth from Angband and poured into Beleriand, coming on either side of Menegroth. In the west, the orcs had more victory, for many of the elves that lived there were scattered, not as numerous, or dwelt as mariners by the sea. Círdan the Shipwright and his forces were cut off from the elves of Thingol, the king of the Sindar, in Menegroth. After attacking the orcs in the west, the elves under Círdan were forced to retreat to the edge of the sea, and they were besieged. As for the orcs in the east, Thingol called upon King Denethor of the Laiquendi, the Green Elves, for aid. Thingol and Denethor caught the orc force between the rivers Aros and Gelion, and the orcs were waylaid between the hammer and the anvil, as it were. However, the Laiquendi were lightly armed, and they took heavy casualties from the ironclad orcs. King Denethor was surrounded upon the hill of Aman Areb, and before Thingol could rescue him, he was slain. But the orcs took the heaviest casualties from the battle, and those that survived retreated northwards, but were slain by the dwarves from Mount Dolmed. The remaining Green Elves would merge with Thingol's people. After Thingol returned to his stronghold of Menegroth, he would hear news about Círdan being pushed to the sea. Thus Thingol would draw his people closer to Menegroth, and Melion the Maya would create the Girdle of Melion with her powers. This would protect the newly named Doriath, Land of the Fence, and none could pass against the wills of Thingol or Melion, unless of course the will of the incomer was stronger than theirs. New days were on the horizon now, for Feanor came with his host into Beleriand, and thus they burned the ships at Lascar. These Noldor that had come unlooked for by both the Sindar and orcs brought new hopes for the former and fear for the latter. But the second battle of the Wars of Beleriand would soon begin. This next battle would take place sometime between 1497 and 1499 of the Years of the Trees. Feanor's forces would arrive at the Firth of Drengist and come into Hithlum. Eventually they would camp upon the northern shore of Lake Mithrim, and the battle would soon come. Morgoth hoped to crush the Noldor before they could establish themselves in Middle-earth and become a true threat, so the Dark Lord brashly sent forth a force of orcs from Angband. This would begin the Dagger Nuin Gileath, meaning the Battle Under Stars. While the orcs did outnumber and ambush the elves, the light of Aman was still in the eyes of the Eldar, and they retaliated valiantly, almost completely annihilating the orcs. The surviving orcs were driven back towards Angband into Ard Galen, but the armies of Morgoth that yet besieged Círdan in the havens of the Phallus came northwards to help fight against the Noldor, and thus the siege upon Círdan's elves was lifted. But Caligorm, the son of Feanor, was ready and knew of their advancement. Caligorm led an army of Noldor and ambushed the orcs at Aethil Sirion, pushing them into the fen of Sarak. Thus, Morgoth's forces were caught between the forces of Feanor and the elves of Caligorm, and battled for 10 days. The Eldar had victory, and this would prove to be a terrible defeat for Morgoth, for the forces that he had planned to take Beleriand with were nearly all destroyed. However, some sorrow for the free peoples and glad tidings from Morgoth would come, for a small contingent of orcs would flee from the battle under stars, and Feanor, draped in wrath and fury, would pursue them with a small force. He, like his spirit, was fiery and vengeful, and he did not know of Angband or its denizens, but that knowledge would not have deterred him. Feanor, the creator of the Silmarils, pushed forth too far, and the orcs he was pursuing realized this, and turned to face him and his few elves that had come with him. Then the Balrogs, under the leadership of Gothmog, their lord, issued forth from Angband. Long did Feanor stand, but he would not be strong enough. Gothmog would smite him to the ground, and Feanor would be covered in wounds and burns. He would have fallen then and there, if not for his sons who had come with an army. The Balrogs retreated to Angband, and the sons bore their father back towards Mithrim. Alas, it was too late for Feanor. and he had the elves halt upon the slopes of Ered Wethrin. Feanor looked out upon the peaks of the Thangorodrim, knowing that they would not be thrown down by the Noldor, but he cursed Morgoth thrice all the same. He wished for his sons to hold true to their oaths concerning the Silmarils, and to avenge him. With that, he died, and his fiery spirit took his body and made it ash. His spirit would go to the halls of Mandos forevermore. But in the hour of Feanor's death, an emissary came from Morgoth, who acknowledged defeat and offered terms and even a Silmaril. Maethros, the eldest son of Feanor, convinced his brothers to take a meeting with the emissaries of Morgoth, but to come with even more elves than agreed, and attack. Well, unsurprisingly, Morgoth did the same, but he had Balrogs. At this meeting, Maethros, the new leader of Feanor's host, was taken captive while his brothers were forced to retreat to Hithnam. Morgoth said that he would release Maethros if the Noldor forsook their war and went back west, but the brothers of Maethros knew that this was a lie and they were bound to their oath. So Maethros was not released, but was instead chained to the face of a precipice upon the Thangorodrim by his right hand in a band of steel. The Noldor would then make a great camp at Mithrim, but not all hope was lost, for the second force of the Noldor, under the command of Fingolfin, would finally arrive in Middle-earth and enter Beleriand from the Helcaraxe, and the sun and moon would be created, marking the beginning of the First Age and the end of the Years of the Trees. The sun would scare Morgoth's forces, prompting Morgoth to eventually create smoke and fumes from the Thangorodrim to shield his army from the sun. The Battle of the Lamoth would be fought where Fingolfin's son Argon would fall, but Fingolfin's Noldor would defeat the orcs in Lamoth after arriving in Middle-earth. Fingolfin and his host would then go to the gates of Angband and hit upon them, issuing a challenge to the Dark Lord. Morgoth would ignore it, but Maethros would hear it and call out for help, but his voice would go unheard. Then Fingolfin's host would withdraw to camp in Mithrim. Fingolfin would find Feanor's host in Mithrim, and he would eventually be made the High King of the Noldor. There was still much animosity between the followers of Fingolfin and those that had followed Feanor, as the latter had burned the ships at Loskar, but much of the disparity would be solved by the preceding deeds of Fingon, the son of Fingolfin. We will talk more about that in the next episode of the series, however. And far away across the vast lands of Middle-earth, in the place of Hildorien near the eastern seas, the second-born of Ilúvatar, men would awake in the first year of the sun, when time and years would be accounted more closely to how we account time in today's world. The years were shorter, and there was a new sense of mortality within the world. There would be no guide from the Valar for men, and many men would actually come to fear the gods. Morgoth would eventually look for them for his own designs, but the Eldar would also guide men into the light. We'll explore that more in future videos. This would be the beginning of a new and powerful kindred that would make and shape the history of the world. Eventually, the elves Turgon and Finrod were given dreams from the Vala of the Seas Ulmo. These dreams would begin to drive the elves to build their kingdoms, Gondolin and Nargothrond respectively. Gondolin, the kingdom of Turgon, would be built and completed by 116 of the First Age, and Nargothrond, the kingdom of Finrod, who was aided by Thingol of Doriath, would be founded in 102. Ultimately, these three elven strongholds of Gondolin, Nargothrond, and Doriath would be the most renowned of the elven homes throughout the rest of the Silmarillion, while there were also other places of the elves, such as in the Havens of Sirion or in Osiriand, near Ered Linden. Again, these places were established or made stronger during Morgoth's time in Angband, while he was under the siege of the elves. The events of Gondolin in its early days would mostly concern Maeglin, the nephew of King Turgon, and the son of Iul, the Dark Elf, and Erethil. I'll have to do an epic character history on Maeglin to really get into detail, but all we need to know now is that after the sister of Turgon, Erethil, went away from Gondolin for a time, she would come upon Iul in his woods of Nan Elmoth, and they would have a son in 320 of the First Age. Eventually, these three elves would go to Gondolin. Iul would try to murder his son Maeglin, but would kill his wife instead, and so Iul would also be executed by the king's orders. Maeglin would remain in Gondolin by the king's side, and ultimately cause the discovery and downfall of the city later in the tale. Besides this, don't worry too much about Maeglin in the timeline until we get to discussing Gondolin once again. I just wanted to mention him for chronological reasoning. Concurrent with the building of Nargothrond and Gondolin, in the land of Doriath, the realm of Thingol, the Sindarin king would learn of the kinslaying of his relatives among the Teleri at Alqualande, and he would ban Quenya in his lands, and his anger at the Noldor who slew his kin would result in him being of little aid to the Noldor throughout the First Age, but he would still be friendly with the houses of Finarfin and Fingolfin. for these elves had atoned for their evils. Now that we've talked about the state of Middle-earth at this early time in its history, let's jump to the focus of this video, the meeting of men and elves, and the coming of the former into the West. We'll see why Finrod Felagund is one of the kindest elves of all time in my opinion. After the creation of Nargothrond, Finrod was given the name Felagund, meaning Hewer of Caves, in Sindarinized Khazd-dûl. In the days of the Long Peace, while Morgoth was yet kept in Angband, or so it seemed, but after the initial emergence and defeat of Morgoth's dragon Glaurung in 260, Finrod would at one point in time journey east in Beleriand to hunt with Maethros and Maglor, but he grew tired of the hunt and instead wandered the dwarf roads alone towards the arid Linden, the Blue Mountains. However, he would see lights in the distance, and fearing that they were a band of orcs from Angband, he would approach slowly, only to find singers of a strange language and people. He would watch and listen for a long time, waiting until they fell asleep. Then he would take up the harp of Beor, the leader of this group of men, and awake these people with song. The men would awake and listen, almost thinking that they were caught in a dream hearkening to one so fair, believing at first that this was one of the Valar that they had only heard of. Eventually, Finrod and the men were able to communicate, for the language of these men had roots in the words of the Dark Elves, who had stayed in the East, and since all languages of elves had one origin at one point, and the elves were great at learning new ways of communication, the elf was able to talk to and understand these men. We eventually come to learn that Beor and his house are the first group of men to come over the Blue Mountains and go into Beleriand, and they escaped a terror in the east. Now, this is the year 310 of the First Age, and men had awoken in the year 1 in Hildorian, and since then, a shadow had crept into the east. It seemed that Morgoth had learned of the awakening of men from his spies and snuck forth from Angband to see if he could corrupt or destroy the race of men in its infancy. But he was afraid of the union of the Eldar and went back to Angband, leaving his servants. While many men escaped such servants, and even with the shadow of Morgoth upon their hearts, they came westwards. Thus the House of Beor would go forth from Assyriant, as the Green Elves of that land did not like their ways of hunting and cutting wood, and these men would go to Estolad, the encampment, and would eventually go to Dorthonion to be ruled by the descendants of Beor, for Beor himself would become a friend and servant of Finrod by his own choosing. From this kindred of men would come Beren, who would meet Luthien and go on the quest for the Silmaril. After the coming of the House of Beor into the west, the Haladin, or House of Haleth, would next come into Beleriand, and they would be more reclusive, and eventually they would live in the forest of Brethil, and would be joined by the Droog, distant relations of the Druidain. They would only come to live in Brethil and guard the Teiglin after the elves under Caranthir, son of Feanor, helped to save them from an orc raid, which was an attempt to wound men from Morgoth. Finally, the third house, the House of Marak, or better known as the House of Hador, would come into Beleriand, and eventually they were given the land of Dor Lomin, south of Hithlum. Hador would enter the service of Fingolfin, and he would become the lord of his people in Dor Lomin. From this line would come the men Hur and Hurin, as well as their sons Tur and Turin respectively. After the coming of men into Beleriand, there were some men that left the elves to their battle with Morgoth and went back into the east or south, but many of the men stayed and regarded their new friends among the Eldar with honor. As for the elves, obviously Finrod loved the race of men, for he was the first elf of the Noldor to encounter them, and he would continue to aid the House of Beor for the rest of his days, even eventually going to his doom to save Beren. Fingolfin also regarded men with much affection, sending messengers welcoming them into Beleriand and giving them land in which to settle freely and rule themselves. Thingol, however, did not fully appreciate men until after the deeds of Beren, son of Barahir, and wished for none to enter his realm, but already Melian, his wife, knew that a man would one day enter the forest, that man being Beren himself. And after the deeds of Beren, Thingol would open his heart and his realm to other men such as Turin Tarambar. But ultimately the race of men would come to learn much from the Eldar, and the Edain, as the men of Beleriand were called by the elves, and eventually the Dunedain, or men of the West, would be the closest allies of the elves for the rest of the history of Middle-earth. Many men would serve alongside or under elves in battle, and the two kindreds would become close friends, even if men were now entangled in the doom of the Noldor. The elves would also see the mortality of men and wonder at it. But after the realms of men were established, Morgoth would break forth from his siege in the Dagor Bragolok, or the Battle of the Sudden Flame. Now let's begin our tale about the ruin of Beleriand and the Battle of Sudden Flame. After the coming of men into the west, and the meeting of Ilúvatar's first and second-born children, the Noldor throughout the land were mostly content, except those that shared the mind of Fingolfin, such as Angrod and Aignor, as the elves who could yet see the Thangorodrim from far off were reminded of the threat of Morgoth. But the elves in more distant lands came to be content and forgetful of the true evil of the Dark Lord. 6 generations of men after Beor and Marak passed, and it was the year 455 of the First Age. Morgoth had toiled long in secret, ready to break the siege that the elves had put upon Angband, his fortress. It is stated in the Silmarillion that if Morgoth had not let his hatred cloud his judgment, and if he had prepared his war for a bit longer, he might have destroyed the Noldor entirely. But his desire to kill the Noldor, and to take and defile their lands overcame him, and he thought little of the valor of the elves, and none of the valor of men. Thus on a winter night, when the watchfires of the free peoples were low, and the guards few, and while many slept in the camps of the horsemen of Hithlum, Morgoth brought his might to bear upon the good folk who dwelt in the north. Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame quickly from the Thangorodrim, the mountains of iron ignited fires with poisonous fumes. This sudden destruction turned the grasslands of Ardgallen into the desolate and lifeless plain of Anfauglith, the gasping dust. Many of the Noldor died thusly, ere the battle began. The mountains of Arid Weathrin and Dorthonion held back the fiery streams, but the woods upon them burned, causing much confusion among the free peoples who held defense in such places. In front of all of this fire came Glaurung the Golden, who was now fully grown, unlike when he was nearly brought low by the arrows of the elves many years earlier. Behind him came the Balrogs, and behind them, the orcs in such a number that the elves had never beheld before. They would utterly break the defenses of the Noldor and their allies among the men and Grey Elves, and many good folk were defeated. This would be the start of the warfare not ended until the end of the War of Wrath. Many free folk fled, and most of the Grey Elves came into Doriath, for the kingdom of Thingol was guarded by Melion the Maya, whose powers did not allow evil to enter her realm. Some would go to fortresses by the sea, Nargothrond, Assyriand, or further east, over the arid Luin, and word would spread of the newly made warfare in Beleriand to the men who yet dwelt in eastern Middle-earth. In the northeast of Beleriand, Glaurung and his orc followers came down upon the lands held by Coranthir, Maglor, and Maethros, 3 of the sons of Feanor. While many free peoples, including the people of Dorthonion, would stand with Maethros upon Himring, a hill in the north, and the Feanorian brothers Curufin and Celegorm would hold the pass of Aglon, Glaurung would come south in the pass east of Himring called Maglor's Gap, taking the fortress upon the western side of Mount Reir, and burning the lands between the Greater and Little Gelion. Eventually, after the battle, Curufin, Celegorm, and their people would be forced to flee to Nargothrond. Coranthir joined his brothers Amrod and Amros as they retreated southwards, and they fortified their position upon Amon Areb, and they had the aid of the Green Elves. Thus the orcs did not pass into Assyriand or Tor Im Duinath. But in the west was a greater onslaught, for many more orcs came that way. The sons of Finarfin would be caught between the hammer and the anvil, as it were, and the brothers Angrod and Aignor would be slain alongside Bregolas, the brother of Barahir. The forest of Dorthonion would also be overrun at this point. Further west, Orodreth, who was either the brother or nephew of Finrod Felagund, depending on one's version of the Silmarillion, held Minas Tirith, which was a tower on the island of Tolsirion that guarded the greater Beleriand from the now plains of Anfauglith. Finrod came north from Nargothrond, and passed by Minas Tirith, coming into the fen of Sarak, but there he was cut off from most of his people, and he would lose his friend Gelmir, a noble elf of Nargothrond who would be captured. Finrod himself would have been captured or slain, if not for the valor of Barahir and his men. This heroism is made all the more glorious, seeing that Barahir's ancestor, Beor, was great friends and even a vassal of Finrod, after the elf discovered men in the wilderness. They made a wall of spears around Finrod and cut their way out, saving the elf who returned to Nargothrond. He would swear an oath of abiding friendship and aid to Barahir and his kin, and he gave to him a ring. This ring had 2 serpents upon it, with eyes of green jewels and a crown of golden flowers. This would become known as the Ring of Barahir after this moment, and it would pass down from Barahir to his descendants. Looking in the north once more, High King Fingolfin would lose many of his folk, such as the man Hador and his son Gundor. In the belief that the ruin of the Noldor was come, Fingolfin rode forth to duel Morgoth outside of the gates of Angband. I go into more depth on that duel in my brought-to-life video about it, but Fingolfin would fall, and his son Fingon would become the new High King of the Noldor. Thus, the aftermath of the battle came. The forest of Dorthonion would be overcome by Morgoth's servants, but Barahir's men would stand defiant of them, even as all of them, save Beren, son of Barahir, would meet their ends soon after. Orodreth would withstand the orcs in Minas Tirith, protecting the pass into Beleriand, but Gorthaur, the greatest servant of Morgoth who was Sauron, would come with his sorceries and take the tower, driving Orodreth to Nargothrond. Tol Sirion became Tol in Gaurhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. Morgoth's forces and servants were bolstered in this time, as many captured elves became thralls and servants in Angband, and the Dark Lord sent out many spies, and he would also gain many of the swarthy men as servants, for they were men who had newly come from the east. While the Dark Lord feigned pity to all men, few men of the three houses of the Edain came to be in his service. Even in all of this darkness, there was still much strength in the hearts and sword arms of the free peoples. The Sindar of Doriath, under the leadership of Beleg Strongbow, attacked an orc legion in Brethil, and the men of that forest under Halmir took up arms with the Elves and destroyed the orcs, who would not return to that region for many years. In that time, Hurin and his brother Hur would be saved by eagles and fostered in Gondolin by the Elf King Turgon for nigh a year, as Ulmo told Turgon that help would come from the House of Hador to Gondolin eventually. They would swear oaths to keep Gondolin a secret before leaving the city. At this time, Turgon would send messengers into the west, seeking to ask the Valar for pardon, but many would be lost and few would return. Morgoth sought to learn the locations of Finrod and Turgon's kingdoms of Nargothrond and Gondolin respectively, but they would remain hidden for a time. After 7 years had passed since the Dagor Bragolok, Morgoth renewed his assault in a siege upon Ethel Sirion, which would slay Galdor, son of Hador, but his son Hurin would afterwards lead the men of the House of Hador in Dorlomin, and they would serve Fingon, as they had served Fingon's father Fingolfin. The dragon helm of Dorlomin was a testament of that friendship, for Fingon had given that helm to Hador many years before, when the fiefdom of men in Dorlomin had been made. Anyway, in that same battle, Fingon fought to hold back the orcs from Angband, while Hurin pursued the orcs across Enfauglith, and the High King was outnumbered until the coming of the ships of Círdan up the Firth of Drengist, and the elves of the Falas broke Morgoth's army, pursuing them as archers on horseback up into the Iron Mountains. This brings us to a good stopping point in the Timeline of Arda, but before we end our discussion, we should look at where the major players are and how the story will progress from here. So much happened in this part of the Silmarillion, and it is quite confusing, so I'll try to break it down. At this point, we do not need to concern ourselves overmuch with the dwarves, but looking at the houses of men, Hurin ruled the House of Hador and Dorlomin, and Barahir ruled the House of Beor, at least what was left of it in Dorthonion, and Halmir ruled the people of Haleth in the forest of Brethil. As for the elves, Turgon ruled in Gondolin, Finrod in Nargothrond, and Orodreth also lived there, and Thingol in Doriath. The High King of the Noldor Fingon lived in Ethel Sirion. The sons of Fëanor were scattered, with Maethros and Maglor being at Himring, Coranthir, Amrod, and Amras at Aman Areb, and Curufin and Celegorm at Nargothrond. And finally, Morgoth and his armies dominated the north in the places near to and south of Angband. Truly, the Battle of Sudden Flame sets up the rest of the events, stories, and characters to come in the Silmarillion, and we will pick up our next Timeline of Arda episode with the events of Beren and Luthien, as well as the union of Maethros and the fifth battle, the Nernaeth Arnodiad, or the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. From the Battle of Sudden Flame and the ruin of Beleriand, we see just how important alliances and friendships truly are in the face of such terrible and daunting evil. We will begin our tale in Dorthonion in the year 460 of the First Age, after Fingon, Círdan, and Hurin of the House of Hador pushed back the Orcish assault on Hithlum in the far northwest of Beleriand. But indeed, we come now to the forest where dwelt Barahir of the House of Beor and his kin, who were outlaws. All of these outlaws would be slain by Sauron's orcs, save Beren, son of Barahir. We are now in the events of Beren and Luthien, which I will quickly summarize here. Again, links for the more in-depth tale are in the description and cards above. Ultimately, Beren acts as a sole outlaw in Dorthonion until he is driven southwards into Doriath, where he meets Luthien, daughter of Thingol. Eventually, he goes on the quest for the Silmaril, given to him by King Thingol for his daughter's hand in marriage. To do this quest, Beren uses the Ring of Barahir and the oath that Finrod made to his father Barahir of aid and friendship to recruit the help of the Elven King of Nargothrond. After the leaving of Finrod, there is political factionalization and social turmoil in Nargothrond until the sons of Feanor, Curufin and Celegorm, leave, and Orodreth, the kin of Finrod, is recognized as the new steward and, after the death of Finrod, king of Nargothrond. They go north and are captured by Sauron on his Isle of Werewolves, where had once been the first dwelling of Finrod. Finrod and his small company of elves are slain, but Beren survives and is saved by Luthien and the Hound Huon of Valinor, and Sauron goes afterwards to Dorthonion, now named Tower Nufuin. Beren and Luthien walk free, but Beren remembers his oath, and after an encounter with Curufin and Celegorm, Beren goes northwards by himself, and Luthien and Huon chase after him. The eldest sons went to Himring, where their eldest brother Maethros dwelt, as this was after their leaving from Nargothrond. Thus Beren and Luthien walked together afterwards upon this quest, and the two went to Angband and stole one of the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown. Now this is quite a large deal in the context of the Silmarillion narrative, as it shows Morgoth could be assailed, which will give Maethros hope to found his union among the Free Peoples later. But after the theft of the Silmaril, Carcharoth, the werewolf of Morgoth, bit the hand off of Beren and took the Silmaril within his gut, and he ran wild from the north. Beren and Luthien were saved by the Eagles and taken southward, even as Thangorodrim erupted, and they flew over Gondolin. Beren was healed and returned to Thingol with Luthien, where they told their tale, and Thingol's heart was softened towards Beren and likely all men as well. Beren took Luthien's hand, but soon a darkness fell upon Doriath from the north, and the hunting of the wolf ensued, where Beren, Huon, Thingol, and some others went to hunt Carcharoth on the edge of the forest of Doriath. Huon slew Carcharoth, but he and Beren were both ultimately slain by the venom of the wolf, but the Silmaril was recovered. Luthien too fell into darkness, and she came to the halls of Mandos, where she sang a song of such sorrow, and Mandos was moved. He sought the counsel of Manwë, who best knew the will of Ilúvatar, and in the end, Luthien and Beren were returned to Middle-earth, where they were to live mortal lives, and they went from Doriath to their own island in Assyriand, Tol Galen, the Green Isle, thereafter called Dor Fern I Gwynar, the land of the dead that live. With all of that said, the major points in the tale that affected the timeline and its factions in a major way were the deaths of Barahir and Finrod, for afterwards Dorthonion became inhabited by Sauron and men no longer, and Orodreth now ruled in Nargothrond instead of Finrod. Also, Tol Sirion was no longer fortified by the Free Peoples nor the enemy, but it would allow for the easy passage of orcs in the future. One of the Silmarils was now removed from Morgoth and was in the hands of Thingol, which would spur more kinslings and the invocation of the Oath of Feanor and his 7 sons later in the timeline. And of course, the recapturing of the Silmaril would enhearten Maethros, and likely the other Free Peoples as well, leading us into the next part of our tale. Maethros would devise a great alliance to push back Morgoth and his forces and assault them, for if the Free Peoples remained divided, Morgoth would destroy each faction of the Free Peoples. However, the shadow of the past was shown, as the union was not as great as it could have been, for the ill deeds of the Feanorians wrought little friendship between the sons and Nargothrond and Doriath. Due to the deeds of Celegorm and Curufin, Orodreth would not march forth, but a small company of his people defied him, led by Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, as he grieved for the capture of his brother Gelmir during the Dagor Bragolok, the Battle of Sudden Flame. Gwyndor and his elves would join under Fingon of the House of Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor, and Gwyndor would be the only one of that company to return home, even after his capturing by Morgoth. From Doriath came only Beleg and Mablung, who would not be idle during such a time. And this was after Maethros and his brothers told Thingol to surrender the Silmaril, and he would not do so. Thingol gave the 2 elves leave to join, only if they joined Fingon and not the Sons of Feanor, and then Thingol strengthened his borders, even as Celegorm and Curufin vowed openly that they would slay Thingol if they returned from war and he had not surrendered the Silmaril. Maethros did not reply to Thingol's defiance, for he busied himself with gathering forces. To him came the Naugrim, the dwarves of Nogrod and Belagost, and the Easterlings under Bor and Ulfang. This force would march with Maethros and his Noldor. In the west, Fingon, who was ever the friend of his cousin Maethros, gathered his forces. Under his banner would march his Noldor, the elves of the Falas, the men of the House of Hador under Hurin, and the men of the House of Haleth under the Lord Halmir and then his son Haldir, as Halmir passed before war came. And of course the few elves of Nargothrond and Doriath would also fight in this host. Tidings even came to Turgon of Gondolin, who shall play a part in this tale as well. Maethros made a show of his power too soon, however, for the orcs were driven out of all of the northward regions of Beleriand, and even Dorthonion would be free of them for a time. And Morgoth took counsel and sent forth spies, for even some faithless men in Maethros' following served Morgoth. However, when all elves, men, and dwarves were gathered that could be, the plan was made. Maethros would draw Morgoth's armies forth over Enfaughlith, and then Fingon would issue forth from the west and break the armies between the hammer and the anvil, as it were. And they would use a beacon in Dorthonion for this signal. On the allotted day, the morning of midsummer, in 472 of the First Age, the trumpets of the Eldar sounded forth at the arrival of the sun. In the east were raised the standards of the Feanorians, and in the west, the standard of Fingon, the High King of the Noldor, stood tall. Fingon looked out from the walls of Aethil Sirion, and on the east side of Ered Weathrin was his host of the factions of the Elves, hidden from the enemy. On the right were the host of the factions of men. Fingon, with the sight of the Elves, looked towards the Thangorodrim, and saw a black smoke, and knew Morgoth accepted their challenge. But a doubt fell upon him, and he looked towards his friends in the east, wondering if he might see the dust of Enfaughlith rise beneath the armies of Maethros. However, unknown to Fingon, in the east Maethros had been betrayed and delayed by Uldor the Easterlings with false warnings of assault from Angband. But hope came from the south for Fingon, as elves and men in Fingon's host took up a call, for Turgon of Gondolin came unlooked for with an army of 10,000 strong elves of Gondolin. When Fingon heard the great trumpet of his brother Turgon, quote, "The shadow passed, and his heart was uplifted, and he shouted aloud, Utulien aure, aye eldarie, ar etanatari, Utulien aure. The day has come. Behold, people of the Eldar and fathers of men, the day has come." And all those who heard his great voice echo in the hills answered, crying, Alta ai lome, the night is passing. End quote. But Morgoth, who knew much of the designs of the Free Peoples, had sent a great force, only part of the whole, towards Hithlum, and they had come far before they were seen. The Noldor wished to assail them, as their fury grew hot within them, but Hurin spoke against it and bade them hold, as Morgoth's strength was always greater than it first appeared. The signal of Maethros did not come, and the host grew impatient, but still Hurin bade them hold so that the orcs might break upon them in the hills. But Morgoth's evil strategy came to a head when the orc host drew very close before the stream of Sirion, and his captains sent out riders with tokens of parley. They rode up before the outworks of the Barad Aethil, and they brought Gelmir, brother of Gwyndor of Nargothrond, who had been captured during the Battle of Sudden Flame. Gwyndor happened to be in the outworks and saw his brother, who had been blinded. The orcs said they had more such prisoners at Angband, and that they would deal with them when they returned, unless the elves made haste. Thus, the orcs violently mutilated and slew Gelmir and left him. The flame of wrath became madness within Gwyndor, who leapt on horseback with many riders beside him, and they rode forth, and they slew the heralds and went on deep into the host, and so the battle was joined. Quote, "And seeing this all, the host of the Noldor was set on fire, and Fingon put on his white helm and sounded his trumpets, and all the host of Hithlum leapt forth from the hills in sudden onslaught. The light of the drawing of the swords of the Noldor was like a fire in a field of reeds, and so fell and swift was their onset that almost the designs of Morgoth went astray." End quote. The army of Morgoth was swept away, and the banners of Fingon came before Angband. Gwyndor and his elves of Nargothrond even burst through the gate of Angband and slew the guards within upon the stairs, and Morgoth trembled on his throne as the elves beat upon his doors. But that company was trapped, and the elves of Nargothrond were slain, except Gwyndor, who was taken, and Fingon could not come to their aid. From the secret doors in Thangorodrim, Morgoth sent forth his main host, and the west was beaten back with heavy losses. Thus began the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the battle of unnumbered tears, on the 4th day of the war. The host of Fingon retreated over the sands of Enfaughlith, and Haldir of the Haladin was slain, as were most of the men of Brethil. Then came the army of Maethros, and hope was renewed in the elves. It is possible that the elves would have won that battle had all of their armies proven faithful. In that time, the orcs were nearly routed, but Morgoth unleashed his last powers, and Angband was emptied. From this third army came wolves, wolf riders, balrogs, dragons, and Glaurung, the father of dragons himself. Elves and men withered before him, and he drove the armies of Maethros and Fingon apart. Some say that Morgoth still would not have won, was it not for the treachery of men. As the plots of Ulfang were unveiled, many of the Easterlings fled with lies and fear in their hearts, but the sons of Ulfang drove in behind the sons of Feanor, coming near to the standard of Maethros. Maglor slew Uldor the Accursed, who led the Easterlings in this treason, and the sons of Bor, other Easterlings, slew the sons Ulfast and Ulwarth, before they were slain themselves. Then a host of evil men came up and assailed the host of Maethros, as Uldor had kept them hidden in the eastern hills. The sons of Feanor survived, and with a remnant of Noldor and Naugrim they hewed out of the battle and escaped towards Mount Dolmed in the east. The Naugrim stood last of the eastern force, as they could withstand fire more than elves and men. With their terrible battle masks, they stood against the dragons. The dwarves assailed Glaurung, who struck down their dwarven king Azakal, who, with his last stroke, stabbed Glaurung in the stomach with his knife. And so the dragon fled, as did many of the beasts of Angband. The dwarves bore their lord away, and sang a dirge in deep voices. They gave no more heed to their foes, and their enemies let them be. But now we come to the slaughter in the west, as Fingon and Turgon were outnumbered 3-1. Gothmog, the lord of Balrogs, came and drove a wedge between the elven hosts, and High King Fingon was surrounded. Turgon and Hurin were thrust aside towards the fen of Sarek. Fingon stood alone against Gothmog until another Balrog came up behind him and cast a throng of fire about him. Gothmog then slew the elven king with his black axe. The battle was lost, and Hurin bade Turgon go, as within him was the last hope of the Eldar, and while he and Gondolin stood, Morgoth should no fear. Turgon said that Gondolin would not now be hidden long, and if it would be discovered, it would fall. Then Hurin's brother, said that if it would stand for but a time, a hope should come for men and elves out of Turgon's house, and even though Hur and Turgon would never meet again, a new star from the two would arise. Myglin, son of Eul the Dark Elf, Turgon's nephew, overheard this and would remember, although he said not. Thus Turgon heeded these words, and summoned the remaining hosts of Fingon's people and his own, and they set out for a retreat. Ecthelion and Glorfindel guarded the flanks, and the men of Dorlomen under the rule of Hurin guarded the retreat, and they did not wish to leave the north, and they would stand to the end if they could not win back their homes. The treachery of Uldor was redressed, and out of all of the deeds that the fathers of men did for the elves, the last stand of the men of Dorlomen is most renowned among them. Turgon, who had once fostered Hurin and Hur and Gondolin for a time, escaped, and the brothers Hurin and Hur stood and slowly withdrew, until they came behind the fen of Sarek with the stream of Rivil behind them. There they made their stand. The sun set on the 6th day of battle, and it grew dark. Hur was slain with a poisoned arrow to the eye, and the men of Hador were slain well about him in a heap, even as the orcs hewed their heads and piled them. Last of all, Hurin stood, and he cast his shield aside, wielding an axe two-handed. He slew the troll guard of Gothmog, and his axe smoked in black blood until it withered. He cried, Aure Inteluva, meaning day shall come again, with every kill, and 70 times he uttered this, but in the end, they took him alive by the command of Morgoth. Orcs grappled him with their hands, even though he hewed their arms from them, but more came until he was buried beneath them. Then Gothmog bound him and dragged him to Angband. And so ended the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the 5th battle, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Morgoth had won in more ways than one, for men had slain men, and elves were estranged from men not of the 3 houses of the Edain from that day forth. The realm of Fingon was destroyed, and the Feanorians wandered the wild, and they mingled with the green elves of Osiriand. In Brethil only some Haladin remained, and Handir, son of Haldir, was their new lord. And to Hithlum never returned Fingon's host, nor any men of Hador's house, nor tidings of such lords. But Easterlings came there as a reward for their treachery against Maethros' host, and they harassed the people of that land and were shut in Hithlum. Orcs and wolves went free in the north, but Doriath and Nargothrond remained hidden and safe, either because Morgoth knew little of them, or the time of his malice had not yet come for them. Many elves took refuge in the havens of the Falas, but ere the winter of the next year came, Morgoth sent a host over Hithlum and Nevrast, coming down the rivers Berthon and Nenning, and they ravaged the Falas, besieging Brithumbar and Eglarest. Even the tower of Barad Nimros was cast down, and many of Círdan's people were slain or enslaved. Some escaped by sea, such as Irenian Gilgalad, who had been sent to the havens after the Dagor Bragolach by his father, and the remnant of elves sailed with Círdan south to the Isle of Balar, making a new refuge for all that could come there. After hearing of this, Turgon sent more messengers to Sirion's mouths, asking for the aid of Círdan. At the bidding of Turgon, 7 ships were built by Círdan and sailed west, and only one survived the storms of Asse, and was saved by Ulmo. He was Varanwe, and we will discuss him more in a future timeline video, as he was returned to Middle-earth. The thoughts of Morgoth now dwelt upon Turgon, the new High King of the Noldor and his city of Gondolin, for they eluded him, and out of all of his foes he most desired to take or slay Turgon. Morgoth hated the house of Fingolfin most, for they had friendship with Ulmo, and Fingolfin himself had wounded Morgoth. Even during their time in Valinor, Turgon had cast a shadow upon Morgoth, for he forebode that his ruin should come to him from Turgon. As we shall see with Turgon's grandson Eärendil, Morgoth had good reason to be afraid. Finally, Hurin was brought before Morgoth, as the Dark Lord knew he had friendship with the king of Gondolin. Hurin, the greatest warrior among men, mocked the Dark Lord, and so Morgoth cursed Hurin, his wife Morwen of the House of Beor, and their offspring, setting a doom upon them. Then he put Hurin in a high chair of stone upon the Thangorodrim, and with the eyes and ears of Morgoth, Hurin would bear witness to the evil and despair that should come to those whom he loved, until all was fulfilled to its terrible end. Hurin never asked for death or mercy for himself or his kin. By the command of Morgoth, his orcs piled the bodies of those who had fallen in the Nernaith Arnoediad into a hill, and it was called Hoth in Nindengin, the Hill of Slain, or Hoth in Nernaith, the Hill of Tears. But grass would come there alone in the desert of Morgoth, and no creature of Morgoth thereafter tread upon that earth, beneath which the swords of men and elves rusted. And that brings us to the end of our tale, at the end of the year 473 of the First Age. We shall pick up again in the next episode of the Timeline of Arda, with the major points and timeline of the tale of the children of Hurin, and the ruin of Doriath. From today's tale about the union of Maethros, we see one of the greatest moments of sorrow in Tolkien's works, but we can still learn from it. It may be that the Free Peoples would have had victory against Morgoth if their people had stayed true to one another. We see what strength lies in friendship from Fingon and Maethros, and if we could be so loyal to others as they were, and avoid treachery, unlike the Easterlings, we may see victory and joy in the end. In the winter of the Year of Lamentation, Tur, the son of Hur, would be born, shortly after the fall of his father. His mother Rien would, after the battle, give Tur to the Sindar of Mithram to be raised, for she would go to the Hill of the Slain to pass away in grief, as she mourned for her husband Hur, who would not come to Hithlum any more. Hithlum would then be occupied by the Swarthy Men, Easterlings, and eventually Tur would be enslaved by Lorgan, the chief of the Easterlings, in 488. I'll get back to his story in a bit. Now, before all of this, in the year 464, Turin, son of Hurin, and the elder cousin of Tur, was born. Hurin, the lord of Dorlomen, had gone off to battle with his brother Hur in the Nernaith Arnoediad, and he was captured by Morgoth. Thus he had not returned. When Turin was 9 years old, his mother Morwen sent him to live in Doriath, and shortly after, Nienor, the younger sister of Turin, was born. Now, as we discussed in the last Timeline of Arda video, Morgoth had set Hurin and his house to curse, and Hurin was forced to bear witness through the powers of Morgoth to such a curse. The son of Hurin, Turin, would bear the brunt of this curse, although the pains of the rest of the family should not be understated. Turin grew up in Doriath under the mentorship of the king, and became a warrior and friend of Beleg, the Strongbow, one of the march wardens of Ilu Thingol. However, the curse followed him, even inside of the girdle of Melion, and Turin accidentally drove the elf Cyros to his death in the forest. Thus Turin fled the forest in 484, and he became an outlaw. Beleg would seek after Turin, his friend, for Thingol wished for the son of Hurin to come home, but the man would not do so. Rather, he stayed with his outlaws, and went on to journey to Amon Ruth, the last refuge of the petty dwarves of Beleriand. Beleg returned to Doriath, but once again sought to be with his friend, and was given the sword Anglakhil by Thingol, forged by Eul the Dark Elf from a meteorite, to help him with this quest. In time, Beleg returned to his friend Turin, who now resided at Amonruth, with his outlaws and the petty dwarf Mim. The elf had brought with him the dragon helm of Dorlomin, the ancestral helm of Turin's family, and the two became quite renowned for their prowess in battle, as the stories of the helm and bow who resisted the thralls of Morgoth became quite a tale indeed. However, Mim, the petty dwarf, did not like elves, and would betray the location of the helm and bow to orcs, under the condition that Turin would not be killed, in 489. And it was so, for Turin was thusly captured and the rest were slain, except for Beleg, who was mighty and recovered. Beleg attempted to kill Mim, who fled. The elf once again sought for his friend, and furthermore, he would find Gwyndor, the elf of Nargothrond who was captured in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears and who had escaped the thraldom of Morgoth. The two went on to free Turin from the orcs who were bringing him to Angband, but in the confusion of Turin's rescue, the man took the sword of Beleg and, in the night, accidentally killed his best friend Beleg with Anglakhil, which he would name Gurthang. Again, the curse of Morgoth had found him. But even in sadness, Gwyndor and Turin were forced to make haste and escape the orcs. Thus they journeyed to Nargothrond, the home of Gwyndor. They arrived there in 490, and over the next 5 years Turin would grow mighty in the councils of King Orodreth, and Orodreth's daughter, Finduilis, would fall into a perilous love with Turin. Now in 491, Tur, the younger cousin of Turin, who had yet been a thrall of the Easterlings, escaped and became an outlaw. In 495 he went to Vinyamar and found the gear left behind by Turgon, and he went on to speak to Ulmo the Vala, who gave him a cloak and told him to seek for Turgon's city, Gondolin. The man also met the elf Varonwe, who was a messenger of Gondolin, saved by Ulmo at sea, and Varonwe would lead Tur to the city. However, in the wild, at the pools of Ivrin, Tur caught sight of someone who he knew not. We'll get back to that in a moment. Now back in Nargothrond, in that same year, 495, the fall of the city took place, for an ill-advised bridge had been placed in front of the once secret kingdom by the council of Turin, and the dragon Glaurung attacked with many orcs. Gwyndor and Orodreth were killed, and the remaining elves were either captured or slain. Turin, however, was placed under a spell by Glaurung, and instead of protecting Finduilis as Gwyndor had told him to do, he set out to seek his mother Morwen and sister Nienor. Finduilis, along with other elves, was taken by the orcs, and she was slain at the crossings of Teglin. But once Turin got home to Dorlomin, he found that his home was empty, and his family had gone. After raging and killing the Easterling Broda, leading to more disaster in his homeland, the man left and then sought for Finduilis. In the wild, at the pools of Ivrin, Turin would come across a man and an elf, Tur, his cousin, and the elf Varonwe. But he knew them not, and cared not, for he sought the elf maiden. Tur and Varonwe went on to find Gondolin, and Tur delivered the message of Ulmo, stating that the doom of Mandos was nearing its fulfillment, and Turgon should abandon the city and leave for the havens of Sirion. In his pride, the Elf King would not do so, and Tur would abide in the city. We will talk more about them in the next episode of this series. Now back to Turin. The man would come too late to the forest Brethil to save Finduilis, and he would dwell among the woodsmen therein. Now Morwen and Nienor, who had come to Doriath, sought also for Turin, and made their way to Nargothrond with the aid of Mablung. The group would get separated, and the dragon Glaurung cursed Nienor to forgetfulness, and the woman ran off in the wild, to be found by none other than her unbeknown brother, Turin. The two fell into love, and were married in 498, for the curse had once again found them. Eventually the dragon Glaurung came forth from Nargothrond in 499, and Turin ambushed the dragon and slew him. But after discovering much sorrow, and that her husband was her brother, Nienor slew herself. Turin would unjustly slay another man, Brandir, and speak to Mablung before discovering all that had happened. Then he used the sword Inglakill that he had named Gurthang to slay himself also. Thus the curse of Morgoth upon Turin and Nienor, the children of Hurin, had come to its end. And so, after this was over, Morgoth freed Hurin in 499, who was now broken after so much tragedy. Again, through the powers of Morgoth, he was aware of all that had befallen his family. He first went to Dor-Lomin, his home, and after finding Easterlings and his kin who shunned him, he went to the encircling mountains, seeking once more for Gondolin, where he and his brother Hor had once lived for a time, under the care of King Turgon. Unknown to him, his nephew Tur now lived there. Yet word reached Morgoth of Hurin's coming, so then the Dark Lord knew the region of Gondolin's dwelling. Turgon, believing that the Hurin he had known was gone and had surrendered to Morgoth, did not let him in. Hurin eventually turned away, but pity came to Turgon and the elves sent eagles to search for him in the end. They could not find him, for Hurin set out for Brethil and found the stone that commemorated his children. He too found his wife Morwen there, mourning for their children, and they had words before she too passed where her children were remembered. Hurin carved a memorial for Morwen in that stone as well. A seer and bard from Brethil named Glirhuin would make a song, saying that the Stone of the Hapless, as the Stone of Memorial was named, would never be defiled by Morgoth, nor thrown down. Thus Tol Morwen came to be, and that grave would never be sundered beneath the waves of the sea, and even in ages hence it would be an outland island off of the coast of Middle-earth. Morwen was never conquered. After this, Hurin went forth to Nargothrond, where he encountered Mim, the petty dwarf who scoured the riches of those halls. For his betrayal of Turin Turambar, Hurin murdered the dwarf. From the treasures within the stronghold, Hurin found the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves made for Finrod Felagund, and went therefore to Menegroth and Doriath. He came before King Thingol and Melion, and threw the necklace at the Elf King's feet to sarcastically thank him for aiding his son Turin. When Hurin had been in Morgoth's realm, the Dark Lord had always tried to put Thingol and Melion in a bad light. Melion, however, used her powers to break through Hurin's grief and madness, and some semblance of humanity came back into the man. He picked up the necklace and gave it to the king in a proper manner as a gift, for Thingol had done much, indeed, in raising his son and helping the family of Hurin. Hurin then left the Elven realm, and round the year 500 he drowned himself in the Great Sea. The tale of Hurin, Morwen, and their children is one of the most tragic and sorrowful tales in the entire Legendarium, and it shows the true evil of Morgoth and his power to curse. That family of men depicted such great perseverance in the face of the most terrible evil of the world, and the fall of Morgoth is made all the more glorious knowing that the family of Hurin was avenged. We must not also forget that even though Dagor-Daggerath, the final battle, was an abandoned idea by Tolkien, it was Turin and his black sword that would kill Morgoth at the end of days, at least in some versions of the story. Anyway, back to our story. Curses were now laid upon oaths and dooms, for the Nauglamir was given to Thingol by Hurin, and the Elven King wished to put the Silmaril of Beren and Luthien into the necklace. Thus, the curse of Morgoth, oath of Feanor, and doom of Mandos all came now into Doriath. In 502, Thingol employed the dwarves of Nogrod to forge the greatest of creations made by elf and dwarf, for the Silmaril of Feanor was placed into the dwarven necklace, the Nauglamir, once the necklace itself was remade. However, the greed of the two kindreds took hold. The dwarves laid claim to the necklace, for it had originally been of dwarvish make, and Hurin had not the right to claim it from Nargothrond. But Thingol grew deeply angry at this, as he himself had commissioned the joining of his Silmaril and the Nauglamir, and he desired the necklace for himself. Thus the dwarves slew the Elf King Elwë, Ilu Thingol, who had seen the light of the two trees in Valinor, and had married one of the Ainur. They then took the Nauglamir in disgrace, but it was reclaimed by pursuing elves of Doriath. Two dwarves escaped the onslaught and told their kin in Nogrod somewhat of what had happened, and thus the dwarves of Nogrod made ready for battle. Their kin, the dwarves of Belegost, warned them against this action and would not aid them. The one most hurt by this incident, however, was Melion, who remembered fair days when she and her husband had met. She knew now that Doriath grew close to its end, and the girdle of Melion gave way. Evil could now enter the forest. She spoke only with Mablung, bidding him to take heed of the Silmaril and to send word to Beren and Luthien, who still lived in Assyriant. Then she went to Lorien in the Undying West to be with her kin. The Battle of the Thousand Caves and the sack of Menegroth took place soon after in 503, when dwarves from Nogrod invaded the forest, and Mablung was killed ere the Nauglamir and Silmaril were taken by the dwarves. However, on their return to Nogrod, the dwarves were ambushed by green elves and Ents during the Battle of Sarn Athrod, and the man Beren commanded the elves and Ents. He himself slew the Lord of Nogrod and recovered the Silmaril, the same one he had cut from the crown of Morgoth, and he brought the necklace to his wife Luthien after washing it in the river, and she was the fairest sight out of Valinor. Dior, the son of Beren and Luthien, thusly went to live in Doriath and become king, like his grandfather, and eventually the Nauglamir came to him, meaning that his father Beren and mother Luthien had died. Some say that living so close to a Silmaril hastened their ends, and Luthien had become too fair for mortal lands. Dior thus took up the Nauglamir, but eventually the sons of Feanor sent word of their claim to the Silmaril of their father. They had dared not assail Luthien when she had worn the Silmaril, but now they thought it possible to regain it. Dior sent no word back to the sons, and so they attacked in 506 of the First Age, in the second kinslaying. It was a bloody battle, for Dior himself slew Celegorm, the very same elf who had tried to force Dior's mother Luthien into marrying him years before. Curufin and Carenthir were also killed. But Dior, his wife Nimloth, and their sons Ilurid and Ilurin were also slain. Elwing, the daughter of Dior, however, had escaped the disaster with a few other elves, and she took with her the Nauglamir, and thus the Silmaril, to the havens of Sirion in the south. Thus Doriath was destroyed, and that realm never rose again. In this story, Morgoth was the only true victor. The Silmaril had gone to the south, and shall come back into the story when we continue to discuss the fall of Gondolin, Tur and his son Eärendil, as well as the defeat of Morgoth. We'll pick up where we last left off, with Tur, Turin's cousin, who had seen Turin on his way to Gondolin with his guide Voronwe. Tur and Voronwe came to Gondolin around 496 of the First Age, to deliver the message of Ulmo the Vala to King Turgon, who was then the High King of the Noldor. This message stated that Turgon and his people should leave Gondolin and flee to the havens of Sirion while there was yet time. In his pride and arrogance, even as he pondered all of the words Ulmo had ever spoken to him, Turgon decided not to leave Gondolin, but rather to block up the secret gate, allowing none to leave or enter the city, for he feared treason. After the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, Turgon and his people were done mingling in the affairs beyond their encircling mountains, so when word came from Thorondor, the Lord of Eagles, to Turgon of the destruction of Nargothrond, the ruin of Doriath, and the slayings of Thingol and his grandson Dior, he vowed not to march alongside the sons of Feanor evermore, nor would he intervene in the outside world. And so it was the people of Gondolin stayed put, and Morgoth continued to search for the city, the last city of elves that gave him pause and any sense of foreboding. Morgoth's spies were not successful, knowing only the general region of Gondolin by the words of Hurin, who had come to the encircling mountains seeking Turgon, his friend of old. As we said in the last episode, Hurin turned away. His nephew Tur had, however, fulfilled his duty to deliver the message of Ulmo to Turgon, so Tur stayed within the city, having a love for the Eldar and their lore. Soon he fell in love with the elf maiden Idril, daughter of King Turgon, and they wed, being the second union of elves and men. Tur won the hearts of all elves in that land, except for Myglin, who was the nephew of King Turgon, the son of Eol the Dark Elf, and Turgon's sister Erithel. Myglin had a dark love for his cousin Idril, and that will soon come into the story. In 503, Eärendil was born, as was his future wife Elwing of Doriath. Eärendil would be the light that sprung from the houses of Hur and Turgon, as foretold by Hur during the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. For a time there was happiness in Gondolin, even as in those years the second kinslaying occurred in Doriath, destroying that realm and forcing the Silmaril within the Nauglamir to go with Elwing to the havens of Sirion. But in 509, Myglin, who had passed beyond the leaguer of the king and defied his laws, was captured by the servants of Morgoth. The elf was tortured, but after being promised lordship over the vassal of Gondolin and the possession of his cousin Idril, he gave up the location of the hidden elven city through treachery. So in 510, even as a darkness grew upon Idril's heart, and Myglin had returned to the city to lead the assault secretly from within, the fall of Gondolin took place. Dragons of the brood of Glahrong, Balrogs, wolves, and orcs came up and attacked the city. During the assault, Torgon and his most loyal servants, Ecthelion and Glorfindel, would meet their ends. But Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs, would also be slain by Ecthelion. The death of Torgon would cause the High Kingship of the Noldor in Middle-earth to pass on to him who would be the final High King, Arenion Gilgalad, son of either Fingon or Orodreth. Myglin, during the assault, would lay his hands on Eärendil and Idril, but Tor would see Myglin thrown from the ramparts of the city, killing him in the same way his treacherous father Eol died, for Eol had cursed Myglin to meet the same fate. After freeing his wife and son from Myglin, Tor, Idril, and Eärendil escaped the city with the other refugees, by way of a secret path that Idril's wisdom had seen created in the years prior. During their escape, Glorfindel would have his legendary fight with a Balrog, which would see his death. The refugees would escape to the havens of Sirion, where had also gone the refugees from Doriath, and likely other lands as well. Morgoth reveled in his victory over Middle-earth, not fearing the sons of Feanor nor their oath. He rued not the loss of one Silmaril that had caused such destruction, and he either did not know or did not care about the havens of Sirion, and the people that then dwelt there. Tor and Idril would eventually leave Middle-earth, passing out of our story, but their son Eärendil would marry Elwing at the havens. Together they would have two sons, Elrond and Elros, in 532. In 534, Eärendil and his mariners set off in search of Valinor, knowing the only salvation of his people could come from the aid of the Valar and their people. Since Elwing retained the Silmaril, the Oath of Feanor would not subside, and the sons of Feanor would commit the third kinslaying at the havens of Sirion in 538. Elwing would flee with the Silmaril, jumping into the Great Sea, leaving her sons Elrond and Elros behind, to her sorrow. Amros and Amrod would be slain, leaving Maethros and Maglor as the last sons of Feanor. Ulmo would save Elwing and the Silmaril, giving her the form of a bird. She would go off and find Vingalot, the ship of Eärendil, her husband. Together and with their crew, Eärendil and Elwing would find the way to Valinor in 542. In the meantime, while both parents mourned their children who had seemed to be doomed, Elrond and Elros were actually adopted and raised by Maglor. Eärendil and Elwing went into Valinor together, stepping on lands immortal, sealing their fate while the crew stayed on the ship. Eventually the crew would be sent back to Middle-earth, but having stepped foot on Valinor allowed not Eärendil and Elwing to do the same. Eonwe found Eärendil, while Elwing found her new friends, the Teleri of Alqualande. Eärendil was a man and Noldo both, as stated by Ulmo, and for those two reasons, Mandos wondered if he would go unpunished for coming to Valinor. In a council of the Valar, Eärendil pleaded on behalf of both children of Iluvatar, being half-elven himself, as was his wife Elwing. And it was through that selfless purpose of them coming to Valinor and pleading on behalf of elves and men that the Valar decided to aid the free peoples of Middle-earth. They decided that a choice of half-elves would be enforced also, beginning with Eärendil and Elwing. From then on, half-elves would have to choose whether or not to be judged as elves or as men. Both Eärendil and Elwing chose the former, to be judged as elves. Eärendil's ship Vingalot would be hollowed, allowing it to be sailed in the sky. Eärendil would go forth in the sky, with the Silmaril upon his brow, and he would be the evening star. Maglor and Maethros knew that his light was that of a Silmaril when they saw the new star, and that the Silmaril was beyond their reach for the whole world to see. His wife Elwing was given a tower to live in by the shores of Eldamar, and she learned how to transform into a swan to meet her husband in the sky. Now the host of the West would be formed, and it would be led by Eonwe, the herald of Manwë. Others came also, such as the Vanyar, Ingwe's people, and the Noldor who remained in the uttermost west and followed Finarfin. Like I've mentioned in previous videos, I am unsure if the Valar themselves joined physically in the assault, or if it was just their people. Concerning this issue, there are definitely arguments to be made on both sides, for it seems the strength of the Valar would be needed in the assault, but Eonwe led the host not Tulkas, who was the most warlike of the Valar. Back in Middle-earth, Morgoth did not think such a host would ever be formed against him, thinking that the divide between the Noldor and the Valar was too deep for any mending to ever happen. In my mind, that was Morgoth's critical flaw and final error, as he did not understand pity and mercy and goodness, in the same way Manwë did not understand evil and chaos. And so it was that in 545 the host of Valinor landed and made war on Morgoth's armies of the north. The Elves and Fathers of Men, who yet remained in Beleriand, took up arms with the west, while some other men, such as Easterlings, took up arms with Morgoth, and that would be something the Elves would never forget. So great was the War of Wrath that it lasted through 587. While the war looked dire when, for the first time, Morgoth released the winged dragons, Eärendil and Thorondor, as well as Thorondor's eagles, came out of the sky and fought the dragon Encalagon the Black, the leader and largest of the winged dragons, and he was defeated. His fall broke the volcanic mountains Thangorodrim, and Morgoth had nothing else to do but flee and hide in the deepest of his mines. But he had the whole world after him. He sued for peace and pardon, but his feet were hewn out from under him, and his crown was beaten into a collar for his neck. He was bound with Engainor, a chain he wore in a different age of the world, and his reign of evil was ended. Most of Morgoth's Balrogs were slain, but some fled, as did some of his dragons and likely other creatures. The host of the west was victorious, and the two remaining Silmarils were retaken by Eönwë, and the slaves of Angband were freed, although they saw a changed Beleriand. So great was the devastation of the war that Sirion was no more, and the lands were changed and broken. Eönwë summoned the Elves of Beleriand to depart, but Maithros and Maglor, great leaders and warriors of old, who had once had many followers, were now alone and weary of their oath. They would stand against Eönwë, alone against the whole victorious host if they had to, for their oath demanded them retake the Silmarils from any who would withhold them. Eönwë, of course, would not allow them to have the two Silmarils, not unless that was the will of the Valar. They would have to return west and abide the judgment of the Valar. Maglor desired to submit and do this, but Maithros saw how powerful their fell oath was, and how evil it had become. If the Silmarils were denied to them by the Valar, they could not possibly fulfill their oath in the west with war in Valinor. Maglor said, though, that perhaps if Manwë and Varda themselves denied the fulfillment of the oath, then would it not be void? Maithros said that they swore to Iluvatar in their madness, and that the everlasting darkness would take them if they fulfilled not their oath, so the Valar did not even have power to release them. Who then would release them? Maglor still argued against attempting to get the Silmarils back, saying they would do less evil in the breaking of their oath than in the fulfillment of it. But Maithros eventually convinced him, so they crept to where the Silmarils were being held, in Eönwë's camp, and they slew the guards and took the Silmarils. The camp rose up against them, and they were ready to die, but Eönwë would not permit them to be slain, so the last sons of Feanor fled. But the Silmarils of their father Feanor burned their hands due to their unholy deeds, so Maithros leapt into a fiery chasm with his, ending his life and taking the Silmaril into fire and earth. Maglor cast his Silmaril into the sea, doomed to wander alongside the waters, singing sad songs. Thus it was that the three Silmarils found their long homes of the earth, sea, and sky of stars. Earth/fire, water, and air seemed to be common elements in the Silmarillion, for Aule, Ulmo, and Manwë were first to come into Arda to shape the world and those three realms. But one could argue that Eärendil's Silmaril is in the stars beyond the winds, and the stars themselves are another powerful element of Tolkien's works, and that is the realm of Varda. Anyway, a large part of the Noldor built ships on the shores of the Western Sea, and many of the Eldar set sail to the west, never to return. Some Noldor, who had once come to Beleriand in exile, returned and embraced once more the love of Manwë and Varda. They were forgiven by the Teleri of Alqualondë for their past conflicts, and they had their curse laid to rest. The Noldor of Valinor were subject still to Finarfin, and the Vanyar returned to their lives under the rule of Ingwe. However, the joy of the elves in victory was lessened, for the Silmarils would never come to them, not unless the world was broken and remade. But the Silmarils could also do no further harm in their long homes. But some of the Eldar had remained in Middle-earth, such as High King Gil-galad, Galadriel, Celeborn, Círdan, and Elrond Half-Elven, who chose to be an elf. Celebrimbor, the son of Corofin, would also stay in Middle-earth, and he would play a large role during the Second Age. There are many other elves who decided to stay besides these, but we'll talk about them as they come up. Men were of course forced to stay also, not having the choice to go to Valinor. And the faithful who had fought alongside the host of the Valar during the War of Wrath would, in the early Second Age, be rewarded with the island of Númenor, and they would be taught long life by Eonwe. Men followed King Elros, Elrond's brother who chose the fate of men, and who was descended from all three houses of the Edain. In the early Second Age, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, who were of the Broadbeams and Firebeards, would migrate to be with the Longbeards of Khazad-dûm. But evil things remained in Middle-earth also, and the lingering legacy of Morgoth and the marring of Arda, as well as the lies of Melkor, were within elves and men thereafter, and Middle-earth would not forget him. The cold of the north would always be a legacy of his. Sauron, his lieutenant, who had put on a fair guise after the overthrow of Melkor, abjured for his evil deeds to his kin Eonwe. Some believe it was done truthfully, and Sauron at first actually repented of his evil, but possibly only out of fear. Eonwe could not pardon him, and he commanded Sauron to return to Valinor to receive the judgment of Manwë. Sauron was ashamed, unwilling to return in humiliation to receive a sentence, and under Morgoth his power had been great. So when Eonwe departed, Sauron hid himself in Middle-earth, and he went back to evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were too strong. Indeed, Sauron was perhaps the greatest and deadliest legacy of his master. Melkor himself was thrust through the Door of Night to be beyond the walls of the world in the Timeless Void in 590 of the First Age, the last year of that age. And a guard is ever set upon the walls, and Eärendil still keeps watch upon the sky. Melkor would never return to the world, except perhaps in the Dagor Daggerath if one is to believe that battle will come. Finally, Beleriand itself was broken and submerged beneath the sea in 587. Those who remained in Middle-earth went east over the Blue Mountains to the lands we know from the Second and Third Ages. But some of Osiriand in East Beleriand survived, and it became Lindon. The eastern part of the Blue Mountains, the arid Luin, survived as well. Also, the graves of Turin Turambar and his mother Morwen, part of Dorthonion and the Hill of Himring would survive as the Western Isles of Tol Morwen, Tol Fuin, and Himling, respectively. There is debate as to how Beleriand sank and why, whether it was from the scars of the war that just made the land unstable, the breaking of the Thangorodrim, or perhaps the Valar sank it to heal the lands with water. We will talk about the early Second Age, new settlements and migrations into Middle-earth, as well as the rising of the island of Númenor in my next Timeline of Arda video. And so ends our tale about Beleriand, the First Age, and the Elder Days in our Timeline of Arda series. After the sundering of Beleriand and the migration of Beleriand's denizens, either to the realm of the Uttermost West or to Middle-earth, new realms were founded and established. In the past few Timeline of Arda videos, it was clear that Beleriand was quite dangerous because of the servants of Morgoth the enemy. But now he was gone, cast out beyond the walls of night, never to return to this world. However, his greatest servant Sauron fled the justice of the Valar and hid in Middle-earth. But he would not be a threat for quite a long time in the Second Age. So new lands, peoples, and kings were allowed to be established and to thrive. In the first year of the Second Age, the Elves founded the Grey Havens and the region of Lindon, in the land that remained from Osiriand, once predominantly populated by the Green Elves. The region's borders were the sea and the River Lune in the east. This is where High King Gil-galad, son of either Orodreth or Fingon, depending on what canon one chooses to believe, made his kingdom. He would be the last king of the High Elves, the Noldor, and his was the last true kingdom of the High Elves in Middle-earth. But there were other elves who had come from Beleriand that were not of the Noldor, but rather were of the Sindar and of the kin of Thingol. Some such as Orifer and his son Thranduil, as well as Amdir and his son Amroth, were not of the kin of the Noldor, and for many reasons notwithstanding the conflicts of the First Age, they desired to rule themselves and other Sindar. They would come to places such as Greenwood the Great and Lindoranand, later called Lothlorien respectively, and they would establish their rule in those places, even ruling over the Sylvan Elves who lived there. So for many centuries in the Second Age, most of the Sindar and Sylvan Elves lived on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, while most, if not all, the Noldor stayed on the western side during that time. Galadriel of the Noldor and her husband Celeborn of the Sindar would rule the mostly Sindarin elves in Gil-galad's name in Harlingen, before going on to live near Lake Ninuiel with some of the Nandor in Evendom, and then in Eregion when the Noldor went there, but we will talk about that more in a bit. In terms of men, the Middlemen and other men of Middle-earth would continue dwelling in their lands wherever they had dwelt before. But concerning the remaining men from Beleriand, the Adain, they were granted gifts of long life, wisdom, strength, and others by the Valar, for their deeds in the fight against Morgoth during the First Age. And the greatest of these gifts was the island of Westernesse, Numenor of old. The men who followed their king Elros, the brother of Elrond Half-Elven and the son of Eärendil and Elwing, finally reached Numenor in 32 of the Second Age, and their way to the island was guided by the Star of Eärendil, one of the Silmarils of Feanor. Elros became Tar Minyatur, first king of Numenor, and his rule was long and grand, as the new realm, and the greatest realm of all men, was come. These men became the Dunedain, or Men of the West. As for the dwarves, those who remained in the ruined and old cities of the Blue Mountains, were Firebeards and Broadbeams, for it was their kin who had built Nogrod and Belegost, left their mountain homes, and migrated to Khazad-dûm and integrated themselves with the Longbeard clan around the year 40. These kingdoms thrived for many years, and the darkness of the previous age had abated for quite some time. This was perhaps the longest and greatest peace Middle-earth had seen since at least the siege of Angband in the First Age, or even the imprisonment of Melkor during the Years of the Trees. But time wore on, and Tar Minyatur would finally pass away in 442, being 500 years old when he died. But still he was a man, and the gift of men is an inescapable doom. But these were during the Wise Years, when kings knew that their times came, and they did not try to overcome them in unwise ways, like later Númenóreans would attempt. So his lineage also went on, as did Númenor, and for many a ruler after him, wisdom and friendship with the Elves would still be common in Westernesse. However, not all evil in Middle-earth was gone, and around the year 500, Sauron began to stir again in Middle-earth. In 548, Silmarien would be born, and since Númenor had not yet progressed enough to let women be the rulers, as the island would eventually do, Silmarien would still go on to found an important house with her husband Elaton, the royal house of Andúnié, members of which would eventually become the leaders of the faithful men of Númenor. King Tar Elendil created the title the Lord of Andúnié for his grandson, Velondil, son of Silmarien. Tar Elendil also gave Silmarien the Ring of Barahir, rather than keeping it in the line of kings in Númenor. I imagine he also gave the sword Narsil to her line if he had it, rather than to the next king as well. And so the lords of Andúnié, while being kin of the kings and queens of Númenor, were established in their own right, and would have political power, and would be counselors and advisors to the royal house. The members of that house would acquire other heirlooms besides Narsil and the Ring of Barahir throughout the age as well, such as the original Elendilmir from Silmarien, the Scepter of Andúnié that would one day be the Scepter of Annúminas, the Palantiri of Amandil from the Eldar, and the sapling of the white tree that Isildur would steal during the Dark Days. In 600 of the Second Age, the ships of Númenor appeared off the coastline of Middle-earth, as the Dunedain ventured further in the world. Turning back to the Elves of Middle-earth, in 750 of the Second Age, Celebrimbor, the last heir of Feanor that yet participated in the deeds of the world, led some of the Noldor to Eregion, on the western side of the Misty Mountains, for they had learned that Mithril was discovered by the dwarves in Khazad-dûm. Being of the Noldor who were great craftsmen, and not of the Sindar who were once betrayed by dwarves in Beleriand, they became great friends with the dwarves of Durin's folk. Indeed, the friendship of the Longbeards with the Elves of Eregion was the greatest friendship between dwarf and elf, at least until the friendship of Gimli and Legolas. The elven city of Ost-in-Ethil would be created, and Galadriel and Celeborn would dwell there for a time, before Galadriel and her daughter Celebrian went on to Lothlorien. But Celeborn would stay as he wished not to cross through Khazad-dûm, and still had great animosity against the dwarves, being a kinsman of Thingol. But during that time great crafts were accomplished, such as the doors of Durin, made by elf and dwarf together. And in a legend it is said that Celebrimbor crafted for Galadriel, whom he loved, a second Elisar stone, after the first had gone west with Eärendil. And if that legend is true, that would be the same stone to come to Aragorn in the Third Age. Aldarion, the heir to the kingship of Númenor and a mariner, would journey to Middle-earth as well. However, around the year 1000 of the Second Age, Sauron began to take notice and alarm of the growing power of the Númenorians, and so he went to Mordor to create his stronghold and fortify his power. Thus he began construction on the Barad-dûr. But Gil-galad even knew before this time that a shadow grew upon Middle-earth, and had sent word to the Númenorians through Prince Aldarion of this dark foreboding. Life in Númenor would continue as the island and its people were strong, and eventually Tar-en-Kalame would be the first ruling queen of Númenor in 1075. Finally, in 1200, Sauron took on the guise of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and an emissary of the Valar, for he attempted to seduce the elves to bring them to their demise. But the wisdom and farsightedness of Gil-galad and Elrond made them refuse entry to Annatar into Lindon, so Annatar went to the Noldor of Eregion and won them over instead. In that same year, Númenorians began to make permanent havens in Middle-earth. Annatar and his students among Celebrimbor and the other Gwaith Ai Myrdain, the people of the jewelsmiths, honed ringcraft for centuries until around the year 1500, when their skill was at its height, and they began the construction of the Rings of Power. At a time when Annatar left Eregion, Celebrimbor and his smiths forged 3 elven rings around 1590 with what they knew, and were thus unsullied by Sauron, though these 3 rings were still outcomes of his teachings and were subject to the Master Ring. And so once 7 rings went to the dwarves, given to them either by Sauron or Celebrimbor, as there are competing stories. 9 rings were given by Sauron to men, 3 of whom were Númenorians, and 3 secret rings went to the elves. Sauron made his 1 ring around the year 1600 in Orodruin, or Mount Doom, and Barad-dûr was completed. When Sauron wore the 1 ring and his voice was heard, the elves knew they were deceived and took off their rings, and they were sent far away to 3 of the greatest elves of that time, Galadriel, Círdan, and Gil-galad. Sauron, who revealed himself and his subtle plans of tyranny to the elves, was enraged, as he had not known about the elven rings, and thus he made ready for war, as he would attempt to do what his master could not, defeat the free peoples and conquer Middle-earth. After the creation of the 1 ring to rule all other rings of power, sometime around the year 1600 of the Second Age, the elves knew that they had been deceived, for Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, was Sauron, the greatest lieutenant of Morgoth the enemy. Sauron's plans with his rings of power, however, failed also, for the elves had crafted 3 of their own design, but still with the knowledge given to them by Sauron. Sauron was enraged by this. What's more, the 16 other rings, 9 of which would go to men and 7 that would go to the dwarves, were still in Eregion, with Celebrimbor, the lord of the Noldoran smiths, and the other Gwaith Ai Myrdain. Or, if the story of the dwarves is to be believed, Durin III had, or would receive his ring before Sauron's invasion. And indeed, Sauron and his plans were revealed to the elves, and a great malice came over him, and so, in Mordor he prepared for war. Thus he began his preparations for war, and around that same time, Glorfindel and perhaps the 2 blue wizards came into Middle-earth. In 1693, the War of the Elves and Sauron began, concerning which I go into greater detail in another video on the matter, but I shall summarize the war for our purposes here. It was during that year that the 3 elven rings were hidden with the guardians Gil-galad, possibly Círdan at that point, and Galadriel. Sauron first made his assault on Eregion and the Gwaith Ai Myrdain in 1695, and the forces of Celeborn were turned aside, even as the army of Elrond made their way there from Lindon at King Gil-galad's command. At that time, King Gil-galad also sent word to Númenor for aid, but Sauron's fury came too swiftly and with too much might. Eregion was sacked, Celebrimbor tortured and slain, and the 16 lesser rings recovered. Elrond and Celeborn were driven into the north together, making it to a hidden valley where they withstood a great siege, and they would establish Imladris in 1697, even as the Elves of Lothlorien and Dwarves of Khazad-dûm were pushed back behind the doors of Durin. Sauron and his forces overran Eriador, and as the Dark Lord made ready to destroy Lindon and break Gil-galad's realm, taking 2 of the Elven rings, a great many ships arrived out of the west. Tar-Minastir of Numenor had sent his great navy and had finally arrived in 1700. They finally saw the shadow that Tar Eldarion knew was coming, and had reported from Gil-galad to his father and people of. Indeed, it was Tar Eldarion's friendship with the Elves and foresight of the shadow to come that aided in the defeat of Sauron during this war. Numenorians from the northwest joined High King Gil-galad and his elves in pushing Sauron back, while others, stationed at Venjalonde or Lond Dire, a refuge made by Tar Eldarion, aided in routing Sauron. And so, in 1701, Sauron was driven out of Eriador, his conquest a failure. He barely escaped the wrath of the first and second-born children of Eru, but though he had always hated the firstborn, the Elves, his animosity with the Numenorians, the descendants of Barahir and Beren, whom of old he hated, only grew. He went back to Mordor, awaiting the time when he might get revenge upon them. In the meantime, Rivendell was established as the new seat of Gil-galad's new vice-regent, Elrond, and the stronghold of the Elves in northeastern Eriador, for Celebrimbor's realm of Eregion was crushed. Vilya, Gil-galad's ring, would also go to Elrond at around that time in secret. The First White Council would be held, Galadriel and Celeborn would reunite before going south, and Elrond would meet his future wife Celebrian, the daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn as well. There was peace in the west for a time, and Numenor continued its expansion, after having tasted power in Middle-earth, and they would begin making permanent settlements in Middle-earth around the year 1800. Ever during their interactions with the men of Middle-earth, the Numenorians, when they were not feared and hidden from, were seen by the Middlemen as great sea kings, and even gods. But the Numenorians had always returned west, but then they began constructing those permanent places in Middle-earth. In Numenor itself, the shadow also began to fall. Throughout its history, elves, Eru, and even death were regarded with wisdom and respect in Numenor. They upheld the ban of the Valar, for though they could see the undying lands to the west, it was there they could not sail. And centuries passed, and with it wisdom. Men, as it often is a vice with our kindred, wanted what they could not have. They forgot the lessons of their fathers, and found fear in the unknown, lusting for things they did not understand, and having hatred for the only guarantee in the lives of men, death. No amount of land or power in Middle-earth could quench those vices, nor the desire for unending life, and the jealousy such men had for elves who possessed immortality. The gift of men was then seen as a curse to many. During the reigns of Tar-Kiryatan and Tar-Atanamir, the great wisdom of old Numenor fell into question, and these kings were greedy men, who levied tribute on their colonies in Middle-earth. They took more than they gave. During Tar-Atanamir's reign, which began in 2251, messengers from Valinor came to Tar-Atanamir to deliver the mind of Manwë, who saw the shadow fall upon Numenor and was grieved. The men sought above their station, they sought immortality, and the elven messengers attempted to explain why Numenorian immortality could not be so, and to help the Numenorians understand their place in the world and in the mind of Eru, of whose wisdom concerning the death of men was unknown to the Valar. But the Numenorians would not accept this, not from those who were deathless themselves and were subject to mannish envy. At least, not all of the Numenorians would accept this. Division rose in Numenor between Tar-Atanamir's group, the Kingsmen, who rejected the wisdom of the Valar and Eldar, and sought beyond their mortality, and the Elendili, the elf friends, the faithful, who dwelt in western Numenor, descended from Silmarien and the lords of Andúnië. They wished to heed the Valar and Eldar, and to keep friendship with them, and to keep wisdom, but even they were affected by the fear of death. The king's men associated less with elves and their wisdom, coming more to the southern and eastern lands in Middle-earth, while the faithful continued to visit the north and west of Middle-earth, as well as Gil-galad and his elves. Sauron, who yet dwelt in Middle-earth throughout all of this time, spreading his influence and domination in the south and east during the dark days of men, must also have known about the division and shadow upon Numenor, for he gave 3 rings to the Numenorians, and in that time, 2251, the Nazgul began to appear in Middle-earth, and indeed, 3 of them were Númenóreans. But Númenor, despite its internal problems, continued its expansion, being yet afraid of the Valar, even if they loved them not, building Umbar into a great fortress of the King's Men of Númenor in 2280, and Pelargir in 2350, which became the chief haven of the faithful Númenóreans in Middle-earth. If the Númenóreans couldn't rule the west, they would rule the east. The 3 prayers to Eru were ended after the days of Tar and Calamon, and the Elven tongue was used less and less. The Eldar visited Númenor less as well, or would only do so in secret. There finally came a king Ar-Adunachor in 2899, when the kingly tradition of taking names in Quenya was abandoned, and the language of Andunaik of Númenor became the new tradition. Ar-Adunachor, the Lord of the West, was a name that seemed to challenge the true Lord of the West, the Elder King, Manwë. The Elven tongues were outlawed in the presence of Ar-Adunachor, and he openly persecuted the faithful. Ar-Gimmelzur would follow in this fashion, moving many of the faithful to the eastern parts of Númenor so they could be watched, or so they could leave the island to go to their elven friends in Middle-earth, never to return. The elves came no more out of the west to Númenor, but Ar-Gimmelzur's son, who he had with the lady in Zilbeth, was Tar Palantir, who followed his mother's policies and ideals, which were secretly those of the faithful. Tar Palantir would repent for his people, taking his Quenya name, for he was an elf friend, and he would observe the ancient religious ceremonies of Númenor, and he would tend to the White Tree, for he was the far-sighted, and knew that if the White Tree perished, so too would the line of the kings of Númenor. But his people were far too deluded, and his actions were met with rebellion, for his younger brother Gimmelchad and nephew Ar-Pharazôn were more like Tar Palantir's father, and they were with the king's men. Tar Palantir alone could not save his people, and the sight of Tol Eressëa in the west was even withheld from him, and no elven ships visited as they did in the days before the Darkening. Civil war even broke out during his reign. His daughter Tar Miriel would be usurped by her first cousin and forced husband, Ar-Pharazôn. Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, the last king of Númenor, took power in 3255, and Sauron would eventually emerge again, calling himself the King of Men among many other titles. For he had indeed dominated the men of the south and east, thus irking the Númenóreans, who set out against him. Ar-Pharazôn and his folk landed at Umbar, and in 3262, the strength of the Númenóreans could not be overcome by Sauron directly, so Sauron surrendered and was taken prisoner. He would destroy them from the inside out, having his revenge against them for his humiliating defeat in the War of the Elves and Sauron. So, from 3262 to 3310, Sauron rose from prisoner to the greatest advisor of the king. It is clear Númenor was failing anyway, so he was only a hastener of fate, likely taking a fair guise like he did when he was Anatar and seducing the king's men to evil. The White Tree was destroyed, and a temple to Melkor was created, wherein human sacrifices to the original Dark Lord were made. He even convinced Ar-Pharazôn to make a great armament, which began in 3310 to assail Valinor and take immortality and lordship for their own. Of course, they could not do this, and surely Sauron knew of the strength of the Valar from the War of Wrath and before, but he purely sought the downfall of Númenor. This he would have, for even after a warning in the image of a great eagle cloud from the west, and the sailing of Amandiel, the father of Elendil, into the west to warn and get help from the Valar, the great armament, led by Ar-Pharazôn, set out to assail Valinor in 3319 of the Second Age, and the downfall began. Ar-Pharazôn and his men were buried beneath the earth on the shores of Aman, as the world was reshaped and Númenor met a cataclysm. Eru himself never intervened much in the events of Middle-earth, but he brought the downfall of Númenor and the reshaping of the world which, in some versions of the Legendarium, made the world round instead of flat after that point in time. Sauron had victory, even as his body drowned with Númenor, but his spirit endured and returned to Mordor, even though he could never take a false and fair guise again, and was weakened. But he was not the only survivor of Númenor. Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Denarion, the descendants of the lords of Andúnië, had made ready to sail from Romena at Amandiel's request, and they escaped the utter havoc being wrought by Eru, God, on their homeland. They brought with them many fair and great things, such as Narsil, the Palantiri, the Ring of Barahir, and a sapling of the White Tree, saved by Isildur, among other things. Just as the lineage of the White Tree would go on, the lineage of Elros, through the line of Elendil, would survive as well. A western wind brought the faithful to Middle-earth, while Numenor sank beneath the sea. Ar-Pharazôn had led his king's men to their doom in the west, during their folly in rebelling against the Valar. Sauron and many Númenóreans left on the island drowned in the disaster, as Numenor itself was destroyed by Eru. However, the faithful Númenóreans, led by Elendil and his sons Anarion and Isildur, escaped on ships and flew to Middle-earth from out of the western seas. In 3320 of the Second Age, they came to Middle-earth. Elendil and his men would come into the lands of Gil-galad and Eriador, in northern Middle-earth, for indeed Elendil was an elf friend, and the elves would aid him and his men in founding a new kingdom, that of Arnor. Arnor would span from the Lune River in the northwest to the rivers Gwathlo and Horwell in the southeast and east, and from the Great Sea in the southwest to the Etten Moors in the northeast. I have always wondered how the borders and jurisdiction of Elendil's kingdom met those of Gil-galad's kingdom, as Elendil's kingdom was in between Lindon and Rivendell. But at this point, many elves had left the lands of Middle-earth, deserting their homes in places like Aregin due to war, while others had perished in such wars. And perhaps the wide and uninhabited lands were granted thus to Elendil to establish Arnor. The major cities or outposts within this kingdom were Annúminas, the original capital of Arnor at this point in time, Fornost, a city that would later become the capital, Aman-Sul, later known as Weathertop, a watchtower of the Dunedain, Tharbad, an old Númenórean port city on the Gwathlo River, and likely Vignalande, the old refuge of Aldarion the Númenórean. The Arnorians dwelt near to elves and the middlemen of those lands, such as the Dunlendings and men of Bree-land, and they likely mingled with those folk of Middle-earth as well as time went on. Now Isildur and Anarion, however, came to the south, where was Pelargir, a settlement of these faithful Númenóreans, and they continued up the river Anduin until coming to a peaceful land between the White Mountains and the Mountains of Shadow. It was there they established the Kingdom of Gondor, and its borders were quite expansive indeed, south along the Great Sea, north to near the Falls of Rauros where the Argonath would eventually be built, from the west and the river Isen, to the Mountains of Shadow in the east. Gondor would be ruled jointly by Isildur and Anarion, but Elendil was still the High King of both kingdoms, although he was more concerned with his own kingdom of Arnor in the north. Their great cities and outposts would be Pelargir upon the Anduin River, Osgiliath, the capital of Gondor at that time, Minas Anor, which would be the future capital, Minas Ithil, which would one day fall to the Nazgul, Aglarond, which would eventually be known as the Hornburg of Helm's Deep by its keepers, the men of Rohan, and Angranost, eventually called Isengard by its future ruler Saruman and all others. Like the men of Arnor, the men of Gondor would dwell nigh to the middlemen, such as the men of the White Mountains, the Dunlendings, and the men of Ravanion, the ancestors of the Rohirrim. They would also live near the Druedain, the wild men of the woods. But they would be further away from most of the elves, except for those who dwelt near the sea, or at the elf haven of Etheland. The men of Gondor would also begin to mix their blood with the men of Middle-earth. As for the relics that came with the men of Númenor from that island, Narsil and the Ring of Barahir would be carried by Elendil, but Elendil would also use the Scepter of Andúnié as the Scepter of Annúminas, the symbol of kingship in Arnor. The sapling of the White Tree, however, would be planted by Isildur in his city of Minas Ithil in Gondor. As for the Palantiri, the Master Stone would be set in Osgiliath, while others would go to Minas Anor, Minas Ithil, and Angranost or Isengard, 4 for the Southern Kingdom, and 3 would go to Arnor, 1, the most powerful of the Arnorian stones at Aman-Sul or Weathertop, 1 at Annúminas, and 1 at the White Towers of the Tower Hills near Lindon. These 3 white towers were built by Gil-galad for Elendil, and the Palantir, the Elendil stone that was placed here, was used by Elendil to look to the uttermost west, but even Elendil could never see fallen Númenor, to his sorrow. And so it was that the kingdoms of the Dunedain, the men of the west, were thus established in Middle-earth. However, the darkness that had spread in Númenor was not fully gone from the world. For a time, it had only gone into hiding. Umbar, a haven of the Black Númenóreans under the sway of Sauron in the far south, was still held by such foes of the west, who waited for their master's return. The Nazgul, wherever they were surely preparing. Sauron, too, had not perished his final end in Númenor. No, his spirit endured, and though he lost the ability to take a fair form, he could still take up power in Middle-earth. Whether or not his ring was with him in Númenor is actually up for debate, for if it was, his spirit carried it back to Mordor, but what is more likely is that he left his One Ring in Barad-dûr in Mordor for safekeeping, and took it up once more upon his return to Middle-earth. Sauron would not announce his return for some time, however, and there were years of peace for the West. During such peace, Isildur would meet with the men of the White Mountains at the Stone of Erech, a large and heavy stone brought out of Númenor and placed on a hill in southwest Gondor. The men would swear by the stone that, if Sauron would ever return, for that was on Isildur's mind, they would fight against him with the men of Gondor. Indeed, such a time would come, and in 3429, over 100 years after the founding of Gondor and Arnor, Sauron attacked Minas Ithil, the home of Isildur, suddenly, with orcs and likely men of the south and east at his call. Fortunately, Isildur and his family escaped the capture of the city, and Isildur saved another sapling of the white tree he planted before it was burned. The War of the Last Alliance had begun, and Sauron hoped to destroy Gondor while it was still young, while he thought it was still weak. But nay, it was strong already, and while Isildur brought word by ship down the Anduin and out to sea to the lands of Gil-galad and his father Elendil in the north, Anarion of Minas Anor held back the forces of Sauron from Osgiliath, while the West united and made ready for war. I imagine Isildur at this point, during his travels to the north, called on the men of the White Mountains for their aid, but they broke their oath instead, having worshipped Sauron during the Dark Years. Isildur cursed them, saying they should not know peace until they fulfilled their oath at last. Finally, Isildur made it with his family to the northern lands of Eriador. For elves and men and dwarves, Sauron had much to answer for, even just for his deeds throughout the Second Age. So it came to pass that in 3430, Elendil and Gil-galad formed their great alliance, and Durin's folk of Khazad-dûm joined this cause, as did King Amdir of Lorinand, or Lothlorien, and King Orifer of the Greenwood. But between Elendil the Elf-friend and Gil-galad, who had always been friendly to the Númenóreans who had good hearts, there was a special alliance and friendship. Elendil, invoking the name of Iru-Ilúvatar himself, bound the alliance in an oath, which was a powerful and reverent thing that only the King of Númenor could do. The firstborn and secondborn children of Ilúvatar were bound together. The hosts of Gil-galad joined with the forces of Elendil at Aman-Sul, and from there they made their way to Imladris in 3431, where they made ready for war for 3 years, making plans and armor, all while Anarion held the forces of Sauron at bay. And as it often was with Gondor, by the blood of their people were the lands of the west kept safe. Isildur's wife and youngest son Valandil, who were with Isildur in the north at this time, would stay in Rivendell, and Isildur would attempt to return to them after the war was over, while his other older sons came with him to war. Finally, in 3434, the armies of the north were ready, and they were so mighty in their coming over the mountains that none could harry them. Sauron burned the gardens of the Entwives and the Brownlands to hinder them, but it did little. The forces of Elendil and Gil-galad were then strengthened by the elves of Lorinand and Greenwood, and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Eventually, they joined with Anarion and the Gondorians in the south, who had been fighting for 5 years at this point. I might also imagine that the middlemen of Rovanion may have also joined in the battle against Sauron. Indeed, nothing like this combined force of elves, men, and dwarves had been seen since the Elder Days, since the War of Wrath and the Nernaeth Arnoediad. For unlike the War of the Elves and Sauron, the West was ready and united on their own terms. And so the Battle of Dagorlad broke out, and though many were slain, such as Kings Amdir and Orifer, and many of their forces, Sauron and his armies were pushed back into the very heart of Mordor. Minas Ithil would be reclaimed, and so began the siege of Barad-dûr that lasted 7 years. Anarion, king of Gondor and son of Elendil, would be slain during this siege, but eventually, in 3441, Sauron was forced to come forth and face the combined might of the Free Peoples. Indeed, Sauron, the lieutenant of Morgoth, the enemy of the Free Peoples, would be laid low by Gil-galad and Elendil, but at the cost of their lives as well. Gil-galad, last High King of the Noldor, a glorious living reminder of the elves of the Elder Days, was no more. Elendil, leader of the faithful and High King of the Men of the West, was ended. And so Isildur, Elendil's heir, cut the One Ring from Sauron's finger with the broken sword of his father Narsil, while Elrond and Círdan stood nearby, and the new High King took it as a wargild, payment for the lives of his beloved brother and father. Isildur would not listen to counsel, for as Elrond would say an age later, it should have been destroyed then and there, but the One Ring endured, just as the spirit of Sauron himself would. In the years after getting the ring, Isildur would write his scroll that Gandalf would read an age later. But the war was won and the last alliance disbanded. Sometime after the war, Isildur would bring some men to the hill Eilennir, later known as Amon Anwar, to make a memorial and tomb for Elendil there. The Second Age was at an end, and though Sauron was defeated, much was lost that could not be recovered. Númenor, the heights of Eregion, Celebrimbor, Anarion, Elendil, Gil-galad, and many others were lost forever to history. In year 2 of the Third Age, Isildur would plant the sapling of the white tree he rescued from Minas Ithil in Minas Anor, in remembrance of his dear brother. He instructed his nephew Meneldiel, son of Anarion, and then left him the rule of Gondor, while he would go to Arnor and rule there, as his father Elendil had, although he was still the High King of both Arnor and Gondor, just like his father. But on his way back north with his men, Isildur and his sons, who had gone to war with him, were ambushed by orcs in the disaster of the Gladden Fields. His men would be slaughtered except for his esquire Otar, who escaped and brought the shards of Narsil and likely the Ring of Barahir to Rivendell. Isildur put on the One Ring, becoming invisible, and attempted to escape while swimming across the Anduin, and the One Ring would betray him, getting lost in the river, slipping off of his finger. Isildur would be slain by orc arrows, and would never come to Rivendell again. Valandil, Isildur's last surviving son, would be the king of Arnor in the north after Isildur's death, while his cousin Meneldiel ruled in Gondor. We will start today just like how we began the Second Age in this series, by looking at where the major factions were located at the beginning of the age and who ruled them. Since the Third Age is primarily dominated by men, we will start there. In the North Kingdom of Arnor, after the death of Isildur in the year 2, his descendants would continue to rule that realm, while the lineage of his brother Anarion would continue to rule in Gondor. Thus, the kings of Gondor and those of Arnor would be cousins going back through to these two brothers, the sons of Elendil. At this point, I would imagine many middlemen lived in the kingdom of Rhovanion, and others lived in the Númenorian kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, and other places besides. The Easterlings and men of the south dwelt in their realms as well. As for the Elves, after the death of Gil-galad and the War of the Last Alliance, the centralization of power amongst the remaining Noldor in Middle-earth would be broken, and each realm would be ruled by its own lords, ladies, kings, and queens. Círdan the Shipwright ruled in Lindon. Elrond Half-Elven was the Lord of Rivendell. Galadriel and Celeborn at this time still wandered in Middle-earth, but would come to dwell in Lothlorien, which was the kingdom of King Amroth after the death of his father Amdir in the war, and Thranduil became the king of Mirkwood in the absence of his father Orifer, another victim of the war. As for the dwarves, they still dwelt under the rule of Durin's line and Khazad-dûm. As can be seen with this summary, the beginning of the Third Age was rather somber. The war, while it had seen to the temporary end of Sauron, also saw the end of many great kings, and many good soldiers as well. But there would still be joy in the world, for Elrond would wed Celebrian, the daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn, in 109 of the Third Age, and to them would soon after be born Elladan and Elrohir, as well as Arwen Undomiel. Now, like I mentioned before, the Third Age was truly the beginning of the dominion of men as the hegemonic people of the world. And while the story of the second-born children of Eru grew in this time, the story of the Elves began to fade more. For while the Eldar had yet time left in the world, their time was beginning to wane. Throughout this age and the many wars of men, the Elves would leave these shores, either from Lindon or Ethelond in South Gondor, but other elves remained to see a true end of Sauron. Others, like Galadriel, still wanted to rule their own realm before returning to Valinor, and there was also the matter of the Three Rings, for while the One Ring remained in the world, they too would yet have power. The Three Rings at this time were held by Círdan, Elrond, and Galadriel. The 9 rings of men were with their keepers, the Nazgûl, in hiding, and the 7 rings of the dwarves were with their respective lords, but would throughout the age be devoured by dragons or reclaimed by Sauron. Now let's take a look at the first 2,000 years or so of the Third Age, and the important world and kingdom-shaping events that happened therein. Gondor and Arnor would continue to flourish and grow, coming eventually into their own separate golden ages. In Gondor, Minas Ithil would be rebuilt in 420 after having once been taken by Sauron in the Great War. Eventually, the Easterlings would invade 70 years later, and this would be the start of many conflicts throughout the age between the men of the West and East, although these Easterlings would be defeated 10 years later by the might of Gondor. As for the realm of the North, Arnor would eventually fracture in 861 of the Third Age, becoming 3 petty kingdoms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur. This kingdom, and its 3 petty kingdoms, saw a population decrease after the Great War, and the later squabbles between these petty kingdoms with the influence of Angmar would see an even greater population decrease. The capital of Arnor would move from Annúminas to Fornost when Annúminas became too depopulated. Looking south once more, Gondor and the Men of the South would have conflict, as Gondor would take Umbar, only for it to be besieged, and for a war between Gondor and Harad to break out, ending with Gondor conquering Harad and reaching the height of its power in 1050, for it held settlements in the south and east. Now turning our attention to matters of the great and wise, after a council of the Valar in Valinor, the lords and ladies of the West decided to send 5 wizards to Middle-earth to help combat the shadow of Sauron that was yet upon it. Thus, the wizards came to Middle-earth around the year 1000, if not some came before, and Círdan gave his ring Narya, the Ring of Fire, to Gandalf to aid him in his future endeavors. Gandalf would travel the lands of the north and west, and the wise eventually discovered an evil power, thought to be one of the Nazgûl at the stronghold of Dol Guldur, which had forced the elves of Thranduil further northward in Mirkwood. Saruman and the Blue Wizards would go into the east for centuries at this time in the age. But where there is darkness, there is yet also light, as there always is. This is our 13th episode of the Timeline of Arda, and throughout all of this tale so far, an important people, yet small in stature and considerations amongst the wise, have not yet entered into the greater story of Middle-earth. Not until now, that is. In 1050, the first group of a people later known as hobbits, the Harfoots, entered Eriador, coming over the mountains from Rhovanion. Around the year 1150 of the Third Age, the Followhides, another group, entered Eriador as well, even as another group of the hobbits, the Stoors, came over the Redhorn Pass of the Misty Mountains and moved to the Angle, or Dunland, in southern Eriador. And going back to men, though they warred, they did not forget their roots, the kings of old, and in 1248, King Menelkar built the Pillars of the Argonath, the statues of Anarion and Isildur that began the Southern Kingdom, whose legacies literally and figuratively loomed over the realm of Gondor. Around 1300, the hobbits migrated further westward, with some even coming to Bree. At this same time, however, evil began to multiply once more, for orcs increased in the Misty Mountains, waylaying the dwarves. The Nazgûl, the 9 ring-wraiths, appeared once more in Middle-earth, and the Lord of the Nine went to Angmar to found his kingdom that he would use to crush the petty kingdoms of Arnor, which were already killing each other's kings and driving the Stoors out of the Angle. In 1409, the Witch King began his invasion of the north, with help from Rhudaur, which had already fallen to him. In the Southern Kingdom, Gondor would face a civil war known as the Kinstrife, as the blood of the men of Rhovanion entered into the bloodline of kings. Osgiliath would be burned, a Palantir lost, and eventually the war would end with a great battle in southern Gondor and a siege at Pelargir. Umbar would be taken by the escaping rebels against Gondor, which would eventually result in further conflicts with Harad and Umbar for Gondor. In 1601, the hobbits would move into the Shire, granted to them by the King of Arthedain of the time, and in the coming years, some Stoors from Dunland would arrive as well, meaning that all 3 groups lived there. The Corsairs of Umbar, or so they were called, would ravage Pelargir in 1634 and slay the King of Gondor at that time. And a year later, the Great Plague began, which would devastate the populations of the men of Rhovanion, Gondor, and Cardolan primarily, and the hobbits would be affected by this as well. This would end Osgiliath's tenure as the capital of Gondor, for the capital would thus be moved to Minas Anor, even after the death of the White Tree, which would soon be replanted. Mordor would be left unguarded, even as the shadow still dwelt on Dol Guldur, biding its time. Soon after the eventual defeat of the Corsairs, Gondor would be attacked by the Wainriders of the Easterlings, ending Gondor's reign over its eastern territories, and the Wainriders would devastate the Gondorian line of kings, until the Wainriders' eventual defeat in 1944. Indeed, dark times were upon the kingdoms of men, which is why they renewed communications and formed an alliance in 1940, as Arnor and Gondor both needed each other, and the King Arvedwi of Arnor would marry Firiel, a daughter of the King of Gondor, for even with the aid of Rhovanion, Gondor was in dire need, as was Arnor, for Cardolan had since fallen, and Arthedain was the only petty kingdom left. But this alliance would not save the North Kingdom, for the Witch King would overrun Arnor and take Fornost, the capital of Arthedain, in 1974, and the next year, the last king, Arvedwi, would perish in the Ice Bay of Forkel, losing 2 more Palantiri. His son Aranarth would be the first chieftain of the Dunedain, and the heirlooms of the kings would be given to the keeping of Elrond and Rivendell. For the remaining men of Arnor would be rangers in the wild, exiles of their kingdom of old. However, the elves could not sit idly by while Angmar took the north. And so, the elves of the north, as well as the men of Gondor, went north to defeat the Witch King in the Battle of Fornost. This battle would reveal the truth of who the Witch King was, a Nazgul of Sauron, and this would begin a rivalry between the Witch King and Prince Eärnur of Gondor. In 1977, the Eotheid of the Kingdom of Rovanion moved into the northern vales of Anduin, while other men would at some point form the Kingdom of Dale next to a solitary, lonely mountain, a mining colony of the dwarves. The hobbits would soon choose a Thane to take the place of the King of Arnor that was no more. In 1980, the Witch King, in his exile from the north, would come to Mordor and gather the Nazgul, and that same year, the dwarves would be hit with the greatest catastrophe that the Longbeards had yet seen, for a Balrog named Durin's Bane would awaken in Khazad-dûm and slay Durin VI, exiling the dwarves from their home. The following year would see many dwarves flee Khazad-dûm, now named Moria, and many Sylvan elves of Lorien, along with Nimrodel and King Amroth, would flee Lothlorien, and Galadriel and Celeborn would become the lord and lady thereafter of that land. In 1999, the kingdom under the mountain would be established for the dwarves. Yet evil moved still in all places, for the Nazgul would soon besiege Menas Ithilien to take it for their own, capturing the Palantir of the city of Isildur. After the fall of the city, it would become known as Menas Morgul, and Menas Anor, the city of Anarion, would stand in opposition to Menas Morgul, thus being named Menas Tirith. The Witch King would challenge his old rival Eärnur of Gondor to a duel multiple times, only for the brash king who had no heirs to accept in 2050. The last king of Gondor rode off to duel the Witch King at Menas Morgul, and he was never seen again. Indeed, it is with the end of the King of Gondor that this episode concerning the beginning of the Third Age and the fading of the kings comes to its end. However, the hope of men lingered still, for the blood of Isildur and Anarion both remained hidden in the chieftains of the Dunedain of the north, like a white tree of hope waiting to bloom. We begin back where we left off, after the disappearance of Eärnur, the final king of Gondor before Aragorn II. In 2060 of the Third Age, the power of Sauron and Dol Guldur began to grow once more, and Gandalf would take notice of this, coming 3 years later into Dol Guldur and ousting Sauron, for the Dark Lord was not yet ready to reveal himself. His Nazgul would also stay dormant in Minas Morgul for many years, beginning that which was named the Watchful Peace, a centuries-long break in the conflict with Sauron. However, we must remember the many smaller victories he had already had, especially with the end of Arnor and the end of the kings of Gondor. Sauron was hiding, biding his time, while his servants weakened his enemies and men. But Gandalf was diligent, and this time aided Middle-earth and its free peoples. Durin's folk, who were still recovering from the fall of Khazad-dûm, followed Thorin I, who in 2210 left Erebor and went north to the Grey Mountains, and for a time the dwarves would dwell there as well. In 2340, the hobbits of the Shire settled Buckland, expanding their civilization as well. But the Watchful Peace only lasted for so long, and fate seemed to bring together many things all around the same time. In 2460, 400 years after it began, the Watchful Peace ended, and Sauron returned to Dol Guldur with increased strength. 3 years later, Saruman, who had also recently returned from the east, roughly around the same time as Sauron did, would be the leader of a new organization of elves and wizards to oppose Sauron called the White Council. Indeed, that same year, in 2463, the Stoor named Deagle would find the One Ring in the Gladden Fields and Vales of Anduin, only to be murdered by Smeagol, who took the ring for himself. He would of course become Gollum, and he would take the One Ring into the Misty Mountains, away from the lands where both the servants of Saruman and those of Sauron would eventually search for it. In 2475, Uruk-hai out of Mordor would once more besiege Gondor at Osgiliath, renewing the war on Gondor. And later that century and early into the next, the orcs began to make secret strongholds in the Misty Mountains, as well as further populate Moria, depicting that all the forces of evil were growing to oppose the free peoples all at once. Indeed, Celebrian, the wife of Elrond, would fall victim to such orcs of the Misty Mountains, and though she would survive, she would leave for Valinor. The same year she left, orcs and Easterlings called Balcoth overran Calanarthon during their attacks on the northern marches of Gondor. and Cirion the Steward would only have victory for his people thanks to the Eotheid of Rovanion, ancient friends from even before the days of King Eldacar, who shared kinship with them. The Eotheid and Gondorians had victory during the Battle of the Field of Celebrant in 2510, and as a result, the Eotheid would be given the land of Kelenarthon to dwell in by their friends in Gondor, and so Eorl the Young founded the Kingdom of Rohan. Though Eorl himself would fall years later in further battle with the Easterlings, Rohan would be one of the mightiest kingdoms of men in the later days of the world. Brego, son of Eorl, would complete the Golden Hall of Meduseld, and the capital would be moved from Aldburg to Edoras in 2569. The Rohirrim would prosper and grow for a time, even while in the far north, the dwarves of the Grey Mountains began to struggle with dragons who reappeared, starting the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, ending with King Dane I being slain by a dragon, and the dwarves returning to Erebor and the Iron Hills in the south. But even in this darkness, I should mention that around 2670 of the Third Age, a hobbit named Tobald first planted pipeweed in the Shire, which would change the course of Middle-earth's history forever. Alright, not really, but Gandalf would come to be very happy about this, and our heroes would not have gotten far without Gandalf, so it was important to keep the wizard happy. Anyway, speaking of hobbits, the line of Thanes would continue, and the great Smeals of Tuckborough would be excavated, depicting further expansion of the hobbits. And in Gondor, the White Tower of Icthelion would be restored. As though the West struggled around this time period, it still stood tall. In 2740, orcs began to invade Eriador, and 7 years later a band of Misty Mountain orcs would even get into the Shire, giving us the second battle that explicitly involved hobbits in recorded Middle-earth history, the first being the Fall of Fornost. During this Battle of Greenfields, Bandabros, the Bull Roarer Took, slew Golfimbel, the king of the goblins of Mount Graham, thus winning the battle and creating the game of golf at the same time. This would be one of the first true tests of the hobbits, near the end of the Third Age, but certainly not the last. The Shire was not the only place to be invaded, however, for the War of the Rohirrim and Dunlendings would also break out after the death of the Dunlending Freka at the hands of King Helm Hammerhand a few years earlier. This war from 2758 to 2759 also coincided with the Long Winter, while at the same time Easterlings attacked Rohan in the east, and Corsairs attacked the coasts of Gondor, all with some similar coordination. However, Gondor and Rohan overcame these conflicts, and though Helm and his sons died, Edoras was recaptured, as were the coasts of Gondor, and a new king, the nephew of Helm, came to the throne of Gondor, while Saruman was given the keys to Orthanc and came to dwell there, loyally at first, but less so over time. During the Long Winter, Gandalf would aid the hobbits, and would see their true courage, remembering this for the rest of his time in Middle-earth. A short while later, in 2770, Smaug the Dragon took Erebor and destroyed the Mannish kingdom of Dale, forcing the Longbeards into exile, and the men of Dale to move southwards, who would eventually create Laketown. Soon after this, the orcs of the Misty Mountains and Moria would suffer a defeat in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, but the Seven Houses of the Dwarves would also take terrible losses. The exile of the dwarves into Eriador would eventually drive King Thrain to attempt to revisit Erebor, but instead King Thrain would be captured and imprisoned by Sauron's servants in Dol Guldur, as the last of the 7 dwarf rings was taken from him. Gandalf, in 2850, who was still suspicious of the shadow in Dol Guldur, would discover this, and he would find Thrain in Dol Guldur, learning the bitter truth that the necromancer was in fact Sauron. Gandalf would receive the map and key of Erebor, which would greatly aid Thorin's company in the future. The next year, Gandalf would urge an attack on Dol Guldur with the information he had learned, only to be overruled by Saruman, who was truly beginning his transformation to evil, as he was searching near the Gladden Fields for the One Ring, not knowing a creature named Gollum had taken it into the mountains. As the end of the age drew closer, the White Tree of Gondor would die, and no seedling could be found. And some years later, Gondor would be attacked once more by the Haradrim, which were stirred to battle by emissaries of Sauron out of Dol Guldur, and Gondorians and Rohirrim both would fight the Haradrim together during the Battle of the Crossings of Poros in 2885, even as the Rohirrim had been attacked by orcs out of the north earlier that century. In 2901, most inhabitants of Ithilien would desert that part of Gondor due to attacks from the Uruks of Mordor, and the secret refuge of rangers, Henneth Annwn, would be built. 10 years later, the fell winter would hit the Shire, and white wolves invaded Eriador and the Shire specifically from the north. From the fell winter, a flood would leave the Númenórean settlement of Tharbad ultimately ruined and deserted. Tarnished was this memory of the Second Age. Indeed, though there were many years here and there of peace for the different inhabitants of Middle-earth during this millennium, especially for the Elves, the years had not been overly kind since the end of the Watchful Peace, which speaks more to Sauron's plan at this point in the timeline. If you've watched the timeline up to now, you can see how many different strategies both Sauron and Morgoth had, and how many of them failed, which I speak to more in another video on Sauron's plans, but at this point in the age, Sauron had time and multiplying servants, both of which he used to his advantage. He was trying to wear down his enemies over time while he searched for the ring, as Saruman discovered in 2939, as Sauron's servants also searched the Anduin near Gladden Fields, just like Saruman did. And even if Sauron did not find the One Ring, he still believed that his plan to wear down his enemies and wait over time for any great opponents who might oppose him to fade from the world would be enough to defeat the Free Peoples, but hope was stronger with the West than with the Shadow. Aragorn and many other heroes of the age would be born in the 2900s, and indeed, as we shall discuss in the next episode, many great evils of the world, which have been in play since the very beginning of this Timeline of Arda series, would be given permanent defeats by such heroes, who worked alongside Gandalf, who, during the events of this episode, was one of the only figures to oppose Sauron in any major way. And so we shall end this episode here, right before the events of The Hobbit. For though the centuries had delivered many hurts to the West, things were about to change for the betterment of Middle-earth forever. Picking up in the early 2900s of the Third Age, where we left off last time, we see that the world of Middle-earth had been darkening over the last 600 years or so. Sauron and his servants had been regaining power, the White Council was faltering in their resolve, and the One Ring was held by the creature Gollum in the caves of the Misty Mountains, which could change the fate of Middle-earth for either side. But just as it often is in stories and in the real world, chance and fate, tied to the will to act, would change everything. After an unplanned meeting between Gandalf and Thorin Oakenshield, the heir of the Longbeards, in Bree, the two decided it was time to take back the lonely mountain of Erebor from the dragon Smaug. This had been on Gandalf's mind for some time, for Smaug and his position in the north was certainly an issue. So, in 2941, Gandalf and Thorin decided to take up this venture, and Gandalf would also take another chance by getting a hobbit involved in the great deeds of the world. Up to this point in the Timeline of Arda, the story of the hobbits had been a small footnote in the greater deeds of the world, but recent events had seen Gandalf believe that they were exactly what the wise needed to accomplish great things. He was right, of course, for the hobbit Bilbo Baggins joined Thorin's company. This quest of Erebor, especially its subsequent success, was actually quite a surprise to all parties in Middle-earth, even that of the Shadow, which had been slowly creeping in over the centuries. Concurrent with the quest, the White Council finally agreed to oust Sauron from Dol Guldur, even as Saruman's hand of treachery was being forced. Thus, the Necromancer was forced back to Mordor, likely earlier than he had designed, but I'm sure he felt like he had waited long enough for the West to weaken, while the death of Smaug and the defeat of the Orcs and Goblins of the North saw a major victory for the Free Peoples in the North. Thus, Bilbo returned home, the Dwarves returned to Erebor under King Dain Ironfoot, men rebuilt the Kingdom of Dale under King Bard, and the Free Peoples of Rhovanion and Eriador were made far stronger. Yet Sauron toiled as well, for in 2951 he declared himself openly in Mordor, and saw Dol Guldur reclaimed by his Nazgul. Even if he could not recover his One Ring, he could destroy the West in time through conquest, as there were none he deemed to be as strong as those in the Second Age were, to oppose him now. Speaking of the ring, he did not know that it was now in the hands of the Free Peoples, in Bilbo's keeping far to the west. At this time, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and the descendant of the kings of Arnor, Gondor, Númenor, and even the distant descendant of the greatest fathers of men in the Edain, learned of his true heritage, and he went out into the wild. He would come to show Sauron that the strength of the Elder Days lived on. 2 years later, in 2953, the White Council would meet for the last time, and Saruman began realizing his plans of treachery all the more. Had the quest for Erebor and the ousting of Sauron from Dol Guldur not occurred, perhaps the realms of men in the east and south would have crushed Gondor in the end, like Angmar had crushed Arnor long before, and then Sauron could focus on retrieving his ring and defeating all others. But now he was forced to rebuild a fraction of the power he held at the end of the Second Age, and he would do just that, taking decades to do so. Things were set in motion now that could not be undone. Aragorn would go forth and aid Rohan and Gondor in finding victory in their battles, and he became learned, wise, strong, and valiant in his years abroad, becoming greater than many of his ancestors since the time of Elendil and the great Númenórean kings before the downfall. While the West would still see some sorrow, such as in the failure of Balin's company, or the treachery of Saruman over the years, the board was being set and the pieces were moving. In the early 3000s, Gollum would be captured by both Sauron's servants and by Aragorn himself, and information concerning the One Ring would come out. Sauron prepared his armies for battle, and in 3018 he began the War of the Ring, which would be the final named war in the Legendarium, for either the Shadow would prevail, or all would be ended. He began with attacking Osgiliath, and some months later, his servants in Dol Guldur and from out of the east would make war with Erebor, Dale, Mirkwood, and Lothlorien in the north. All the while, the Nazgûl searched for the Shire and the One Ring, but of course Gandalf and the others were not inactive. Gandalf learned all he could of the ring, and helped Frodo, Bilbo's heir and the new ring-bearer, set off on his adventure. Saruman would betray the West, causing many issues for Gandalf and Rohan. The Fellowship of the Ring would be formed in Rivendell, and in the Misty Mountains, Gandalf and Durin's Bane would meet their ends at the hands of one another, even as the ring made its way east and south. The Fellowship would break, and some members would come to Rohan, even as Gandalf, who returned from death as Gandalf the White, aided some of the members of the Fellowship of the Ring in stopping Saruman and saving Rohan from its weakened state. All the while Frodo, with Sauron's ring, and his companion Sam would encounter Gollum, who aided them during their adventures. Gondor was on the brink of collapse, and as the Ring-Bearer made his way closer to Mordor, coming into conflict with Shelob, the spawn of Ungoliant from the Elder Days, Gandalf, Aragorn, Rohan, and many others saved Gondor as well. Even though many things were happening that surprised and beat Sauron back, both the Lieutenant of Morgoth and the Free Peoples knew it was only a matter of time before he won in the end, unless the One Ring could be destroyed. In a last gambit, the Battle of the Black Gate, even while the Siege of Erebor happened in the north, the hopes of the West came down to this diversion to give Frodo enough time to destroy the One Ring. And in the end it would be destroyed, but once more, by chance and fate, as it would be Gollum who took the ring and fell into the fires of Mount Doom, ending not only the plan of taking Middle-earth through the rings of power that Sauron had made in the Second Age, but ending also the last true remnant of Morgoth's treachery from the Elder Days. Middle-earth was restored, even as the Shadow ended. The hobbits were heralded as heroes by those who survived, and they were seen to be as great as the heroes from the ancient days of the world, heroes we discussed in this very timeline. The fating of the kings was reversed, as Aragorn became King Elessar. The kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, the kingdoms of the Men of the West, would be restored under King Elessar, and a sapling of a new white tree would be found and planted. The lines of Elros and Elrond were met once again in the marriage of Aragorn and Arwen. The works of Sauron, such as Dol Guldur, would be utterly destroyed. The hobbits would return home and end the threat of the fallen Maya Saruman, saving their Shire as well. And so it was with that, with the final end of Sauron and his works. The Third Age swiftly came to its end soon after. With it, the time of the Elves was ending. And since this timeline and the greater scope of Tolkien primarily followed the days of the Elves, the end of Tolkien's timeline was near at hand. The destruction of the One Ring made the remaining rings of power fade, and the time came for their bearers to return to the West. Just as many of their ancestors, or even some of them themselves, had once left Valinor in exile. The remaining bearers of the One Ring would be offered places in the uttermost West as well, all of which would eventually be accepted. Many years before, the Elves were exiled in the pursuit of Morgoth and his evils, in the hopes that they could one day defeat them and rule their own realms. These hopes were then accomplished, as Morgoth, Sauron, and their darkness had been defeated, although the marring and scars upon Arda would never fully heal. Many realms of the Eldar had risen and fallen over the ages, and it was time to pass the world of Middle-earth into the hands of men. So it was that most of the Elves, Gandalf, and some others passed into the West in the late Third Age and early Fourth Age. Middle-earth was come into its later years. King Elessar and Queen Arwen Undolmiel saw the restoration of Arnor and Gondor. and King Elisar and King Eomer of Rohan had war and eventual peace with men in the east and south. The dwarves reclaimed their kingdom of Khazad-dûm at long last, and hobbits had peace in their newly expanded shire. It seems that eventually hobbits would disappear from the world of men, becoming too hard to locate and find in their stealthy nature, and sometime after the coming of Durin VII, the dwarves would disappear from this world into their homes. The greatest tales of Middle-earth were written in the Red Book of Westmarch, and a copy of it came to Gondor and thus made its way into the world of men, our world, and a certain professor made sure that the world saw it. While the story of the New Shadow would not be made canon, it is possible for one to say that another evil would rise in the early Fourth Age. If one regards it as canon, we may also say that the Dagor Dagoroth, the final battle, and the second music of the Ainur have yet to come as well, of which we all shall be included. But we dwell now here in our world, the days of the Elves and Valar, long since past, but not lost, never lost. Yet even now we may look to the evening star, and see the light of Eärendil's Silmaril, keeping us safe from the shadow of Morgoth in the void. Although Tolkien's world is just a story, it is a powerful one, a fictional telling of history, a mythology to brighten our world, and to give us comfort and hope, even when nothing seems certain. And so we come to the end of our story and the timeline of Arda. From this tale we see that chance, fate, and free will can all coincide to defeat even the darkest of days and bring us into a better and brighter day. My friends, thank you all so much for watching that compilation of the Timeline of Arda series. I hope you enjoyed this and learned more about Tolkien's works, or got a chance to review and revisit some awesome points in Tolkien's Legendarium's history. Even for myself, editing and fixing a few things throughout all of this, it's just been an emotional journey. I mean, this was a series that took me 5 years, and I finished it a few years ago, or I think 4 years ago. And so it's just been awesome to go back through and listen to a lot of it and rewatch and work on it. I mean, Tolkien's works are just so amazing. And yeah, thank you all for joining me on this journey. And all the journeys since then, all the journeys to come. Really appreciate it. I had a blast working on this video, truly. I'm very proud of this series, for sure. And so, means a lot. And if you would like to support the channel and the work I'm doing here, please consider joining our Patreon and YouTube memberships. That's certainly the best way to support the Men of the West. Please like this video, share it with a friend that you would like to dump all of this Middle-earth lore on. It's a lot, but, that's how you know they're your true friend. And please let me know your favorite part of the timeline or the story in the comments below. I'm going to actually probably try to do more of these compilation videos if you liked this one, so let me know what you'd like to see next. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Joby Weasel, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Zoomi, Peter Sheppard, and Malleus Flavus. Thank you so much to all of our patrons. It really means a lot. And my friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this grand adventure. Until the next one.